Chapter 1. Nick. You should kill yourself. Inside a dirty alleyway filled with oily pipes, electrical wires, and broken walls, a young man sat on the ground with his back to the wall. His head was lowered as he lifelessly stared at the ground visible between his legs. The sun was positioned in the middle of the sky, perfectly above this boy. Because of that, the alleyway was brightly lit. I know that it comes as a bit of a shock, but I genuinely think the best course of action for you in this situation would be to kill yourself. The boy didn't lift his head as he heard these words. At this moment, a dirty and disheveled rat was sitting on top of a small rusty box made of metal. The rat was lightly scratching its snout as it looked with widely opened eyes at the boy, trying to establish eye contact. "Listen," the rat said as it jumped down from the box and slowly walked towards the boy. "We all know what happened. It's not like I'm suggesting suicide without a logical basis, you know." As the rat came closer, the boy's eyes suddenly gained life, and he looked at the rat with intensity. The rat's eyes widened, and it went on its hind legs as it slowly retreated. "Calm down, Nick. I'm not going to hurt you," it said with a nervous smile as it stopped retreating. "Look at me. I'm just a rat. How am I supposed to hurt someone that managed to get through the Zephyx extractor exam?" The boy, Nick, looked back at the ground. When Nick just lifelessly looked at the ground like that, he looked like a frail, homeless person. But when he just looked at the rat, his entire demeanor changed. In fact, Nick's body was anything but frail. While he wasn't very bulky, his muscles were pretty defined, which wasn't surprising, considering that he had trained for the last 4 years in hopes of finally getting out of the dregs. "Hey, Nick," the rat said, not daring to get any closer. "I know that you're still holding on to some hope, but we both know that believing in this fickle light of hope is just delusional." The rat slowly moved around Nick's body, but it didn't dare to get too close to his body. "Over the last 4 years, you worked so hard on yourself, you trained every day, and you even committed some terrible acts just to avoid paying the blood tax. You didn't want to do these things, but you still did them. Why? Because you saw a way out of the dregs, and you did it. You managed to get a spot in the Zephyx extractor exam for Ghosty's lab, and you even managed to pass it," the rat said with a lot of enthusiasm. And then, the rat just sighed. "But your Zephyx synchronizer was already attuned to a specter. You managed to pass the exam, but Ghosty's lab can't use a Zephyx extractor with an already synchronized Zephyx synchronizer. And you know that they are not the only ones," the rat said as it stopped on Nick's right side. "No Zephyx manufacturer will hire you like this. You know as well as I that all the companies have specific specters for their extractors. Without the abilities from these specters, you will either die very quickly or will cost the company more money than you bring in." "So what now?" the rat asked, looking at Nick with a sympathetic expression. "What's the plan now? You don't have an education. You don't have contacts. You don't have a place to live. You don't even remember anything from before you were 10. You can't even join the gangs or any of their businesses since you vehemently refuse to pay them their fees. There's no way out. Are you willing to continue living like this?" the rat asked with a sad and pained voice. "I don't want to see you go through so much pain every day. Just stop." The rat was carefully and slowly moving toward Nick. As the rat moved closer to Nick, several pairs of eyes appeared behind the dark sewer grates in the alley. They were watching everything with excitement. Nick just continued looking at the ground. "Don't you just want to rest?" the rat asked as it very carefully moved forward. "Every day you sleep with one eye open, fearing that something or someone will attack you. You don't even have a single friend or family member. What's the point of fighting? What's the point of living like this? And now, even your last hope is gone." The rat looked with a sympathetic gaze at Nick. "Trust me. I've talked to millions of people, and I know a hopeless situation when I see one. I can make it quick and painless. If you want, I can even pay special attention to some people you dislike. At least like this, you can go out on your own terms instead of just starving to death. Your death would actually have a purpose." The rat managed to get so close to Nick that it could even touch his leg. The rats behind the sewer grates slowly and carefully stepped out, but they still remained at a great distance. It was important not to induce a fight or flight response in their target. Adrenaline can bring momentary life to the black hole inside the chest of a suffering person. This had to be done methodically, slowly, and carefully. "Just lay down, okay?" the rat said slowly. "I am going to lightly touch your leg now. Don't be afraid. I won't do anything." The rat slowly extended its claw to touch Nick's leg. Bang! A powerful fist hit the rat, turning it into a bloody paste. An instant later, all the other rats fled back into the sewer. Silence. The fist unclenched and took hold of the smashed rat. Then he took out a filthy, old, and disgusting brown sack and put the rat into it. A moment later, Nick straightened his back and took a deep breath. "This sucks," he said, his voice a bit deeper than the average man's. But then, a small smile formed on his lips as he lifted the dirty brown sack. "But at least dinner is secured." Suddenly, Nick's eyes narrowed as he shot up to his feet. He glared down one of the alleyway's exits. Just now, a muscular man wearing a black coat and black hat had appeared near that exit. At this moment, Nick could see a mysterious smirk adorning the man's lips as he looked at Nick with amusement. "What do you want?" Nick asked, with a harsh and threatening voice. Nick had seen many people, and he knew that someone that was acting like this wasn't up to anything good. "I don't buy drugs, miracle cures, specters, Zephyx, or whatever you have to sell," Nick said. A moment later, Nick's eyes widened a bit, and he put the brown sack behind him. "I'm also not selling you the rat." The man looked slightly taken aback, but he started chuckling in amusement. "Your rat? You think I'm after your rat?" he asked with a smirk. Nick eyed the man suspiciously. "I'm not buying anything also. It's rude to enter someone's home unannounced." "Home?" the man repeated in confusion as he looked around the alleyway. After looking for a bit, the man saw a small shack made of bits and pieces of discarded and rusty metal. The man took a deep breath and sighed before his black hat vanished, revealing his handsome face. There were a couple of covert wrinkles on the man's forehead, and Nick could also see a couple of individual gray hairs among his usual black hair. The man just chuckled a bit. "You asked me what I wanted," he repeated. "Well, you could call me a scholar," the man said with a smile as he looked at Nick. "I study specters. More specifically, the powers specters can bestow to humans." "I said I'm not buying anything," Nick shouted. The man took another deep breath and released a sigh. "I am a consultant to many Zephyx manufacturers, and Ghosty's lab is one of them," the man said as he slowly lifted his right index finger. The next moment, a ball of bloody tools made of metal materialized above his finger. The tools were rapidly circling above the man's finger. When Nick saw that, his jaw nearly hit the floor and his eyes shone. "You're a Zephyx extractor?" he asked in shock. The man chuckled. "In the past," he said as the tools vanished again. "Nowadays, I am just a researcher." Nick still looked with wonder at the man. "A Zephyx extractor." Nick gulped. "Okay," he slowly said. "So what do you have to sell?" The man snorted in amusement. "I'm not here to sell anything. I'm here because my friend at Ghosty's lab contacted me. They don't know what kind of power you've attained or from which specter it comes. My friend knows that I am interested in these things, which was why he told me about you." Nick became nervous when he heard that. That sounded like some evil experimentation stuff. When the man saw Nick's apprehensive expression, he nearly groaned. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man half shouted with annoyance. "I'm just here to look at how your powers work. I will even refer you to some Zephyx manufacturers if your power proves to be useful. This is a good thing for you." Nick was taken aback, but his expression quickly morphed into one of skepticism. "Help? A good thing? In the dregs? Not even children would believe that." "And what do you want in exchange?" Nick asked. "In exchange?" the man repeated. "Do you even have anything that can interest me?" Nick struggled to think of something. "Nothing in this world is free," Nick said with suspicion. Something advertised as free will very quickly turn into something that's not free after some time. The man's expression turned deadpan. "Oh my fucking God," he said in exasperation. Suddenly the man appeared in front of Nick. Bang! The man hit Nick's head, and Nick fell to the side. Unconscious. Is it so hard to accept that someone just wants to help you? Silence. The man took another deep breath and sighed. Shing. The bloody tools from earlier appeared in front of him. Now let's see what kind of power you have. Chapter 2. The Sign. A young man walked through the streets of a lively but dirty city. At this moment, it was 2 a.m., but the sun was still shining. It was always shining. There was not a single moment where it wasn't shining. This was how it had been for thousands of years, and how it would continue to be for thousands more years. The sun was directly in the middle of the sky, seemingly perfectly above the walking young man. Surprisingly, even though the sun was in the middle of the sky, its light wasn't very bright and overwhelming, but subdued and more orange-yellowish in color. For the citizens of Crimson Fungus City, it was currently nighttime. Although, when one talked about night, they were referring to the time between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. This had nothing to do with the state or location of the sun, since that was always static. Most people slept during the nighttime. No one really knew why, but most people followed that social norm since their parents, grandparents, and everyone else had done the same. Some crazy people said that people slept during the night because somehow the sun used to do something called setting in the past. Naturally, that was idiotic. How fast would the sun need to move to go around the earth? How would it even move? It made no sense. As the young man continued walking, he saw several dirty, grimy, and rusty pipes coming out of the ground, which then slithered up the damaged and dirty walls of buildings. The floor of the city was uneven, with half of it made of craggy rock, and the other half made of rusty grates that led deep underground. The smell of gas and oil blanketed the streets, but the people living here had already gotten used to it. Crack. Suddenly, one of the grates below the young man's legs broke, and the young man began to fall. However, the young man just reflexively spread his arms and grabbed the grates to his side, stopping his fall. The young man took a deep breath and released it before he pulled himself up. After pulling himself up, he looked around the street for something. He saw a couple of thin people that were sitting at the side of the road, talking with each other. Since it was nighttime, not many people were here. "Hey, do you know where I can get a big sheet of metal?" the young man, Nick, asked the group. It had been 2 years since Nick had met the scholar, and Nick was now 16 years old. The scholar had told Nick about his power, and he even taught him a couple of things over the next couple of days. Right now, Nick was about 180 centimeters tall, which was enormous for someone living in the dregs. The available food was horrible, which made it difficult for people to grow tall. Nick's body was also still quite muscular, giving him quite an intimidating appearance. The group collectively furrowed their brows as they looked at him. Nick's bulky figure intimidated them a bit. "What do you want?" an older lady among them said with a tone of threat in her voice. "I just told you what I want," Nick said as he scratched the side of his head. "I just want a sheet of metal." "Why?" the older lady asked with annoyance. Nick just pointed at the hole in the grates with his thumb. The group just threw a couple of glances at each other. "You want to repair the hole?" the older lady asked with skepticism. Nick nodded. "I'm strong enough to stop my fall and pull myself out. Others aren't," he answered. The lady's expression became even more skeptical. "And you care about that?" Nick just scratched the back of his head. "I mean, I broke it. I should also fix it," he said with a shrug. The group looked at each other again. Then, the older lady pointed at one of the houses at the edge of the street. The house was basically a ruin. A third of it was already missing, and all the metal of the house had already rusted. The city had an overabundance of metal, and all the metal that the wealthy parts of the city didn't need anymore ended up in the dregs. This was also why nearly all houses here were made of rusty metal. "The occupant of it said it 2 days ago," the older lady said, her voice neutral. Nick nodded. He knew what it meant to say it. It basically meant that the person had committed suicide via a specific method. "Thanks," Nick said as he walked over to the derelict house. After a bit of searching, Nick saw a 2-meter wide and long plate of metal and began to pull. Sadly, the builder of the house seemed to have had a phobia of his house collapsing, which was why he welded everything together. Nick tried for a while, but the metal plate only shuddered and made creaking noises. Nick just sighed and looked around. Then, He walked into the house, away from all prying eyes. Bang! A dent appeared in the metal plate. Bang! 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 After 4 hits, the metal plate broke away from the house and fell to the ground outside as Nick exited through the new hole. The eyes of the earlier group widened in shock. They knew that this young man was strong based on his stature, but wasn't this a bit too much? How much power would one need to dent such a big metal plate? Sure, it wasn't super thick, but this was still metal. Nick pulled the metal plate across the street with quite some difficulties, confusing the group even more. The guy had just dented the plate, but now he had issues carrying it. This made no sense. A couple of seconds later, Nick put the plate over the hole in the grate that he had created earlier and rubbed the sweat off his forehead. He walked on top of the plate and jumped a bit. The metal was creaking, but it didn't move. If the metal could withstand Nick jumping on it, no one would have issues walking over it. Nick nodded with satisfaction and continued walking through the streets. He waved a bit at the group as he left. "Oh, now I know who that is," one of the younger people in the group shouted a couple of seconds later. The others looked at him. "You know him?" The younger guy nodded. "He's that weird guy at the marketplace." "The weird guy?" Another person from the group repeated with uncertainty. "Oh, you mean the one that just sits there with a sign all day?" "Yes, that guy," the other guy said with a nod. "I didn't recognize him since he looks much smaller when he's sitting." The other people raised their eyebrows in understanding. Some of them looked at the derelict house again with newfound realization. That explained how he was strong enough to break the metal. This means he has an attuned Zephix synchronizer, right? The others just nodded. According to his sign, yes. The older lady in the group looked at the sheet of metal in the middle of the street. "You know, if others actually followed his example and fixed what they broke, the dregs wouldn't be nearly as bad," she commented. Nick continued walking down the street, and a couple of minutes later, he arrived at a big plaza. In comparison to the streets, the plaza was mostly made of stone, and the walls weren't too dirty. Nick could see a couple of merchants stationed around their wagons filled with wares. Since it was night, only the poorest and the richest merchants sold their wares. The poorest sold their wares at night since there was far less competition, and the richest did the same since they could just hire someone to keep their shop open all the time. The other 80% of shops were only open between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Nick walked across the plaza until he arrived at the widest road in the dregs. The road led to one of the exits of Crimson Fungus City. At the spot where the road and the plaza met, Nick stopped and walked to the side. After sitting down, Nick pulled out a roll of cardboard and unrolled it before putting it on a metal rod he had brought with him. Lastly, Nick just lifted his new sign and waited. Zephix Extractor looking for work. And then, he waited. Chapter 3, Protecting Oneself. People slowly woke up and exited from their derelict houses. It was early in the morning, but just like always, the sun was high up in the sky, illuminating the streets. Nick was still holding his sign as he watched the people with boredom. Over 50% of the people were malnourished, and the remainder could still be called skinny. Only the richest merchants had some visible fat on their bellies. Even though the sun was shining all day, nearly everyone had pale skin, and a couple of them even had black rings around their eyes as they slowly walked through the streets. As Nick saw the people, he could tell that most of them were very fidgety and anxious. Nick knew that this day would be the most dangerous day of the month since people became desperate. Today was the worst day of the month, the day everyone dreaded. Nevertheless, Nick continued holding up his sign as he waited. Albert, Nick's mentor, told him he would soon find work as a Zephix extractor in the dregs. He only needed to be visible. Albert was the powerful Zephix extractor that Nick had met 2 years ago. After Nick had woken up from Albert's slap, the two of them had gotten to know each other. Due to the circumstances of how Nick had gained his mysterious power, Albert decided to mentor Nick for a couple of months since he saw a lot of potential in him. Albert had left around a year ago, and he told Nick that he just needed to remain visible to find work. Apparently someone would soon appear that would be interested in finding Zephix extractors. This was why Nick was sitting in the marketplace with his sign. Even though everyone dreaded today, to Nick, this was just like any other day. Many people passed by Nick, and he also noticed that nearly everyone was throwing evaluating glances at him. However, no one actually did anything to him. Many people were scared and looked around nervously, but others seemed calm and relaxed. All of the calm ones had small pins on their chest in the image of two crossed spears. These pins represented the insurance gang, one of the most powerful gangs that were running the dregs from the underground. The people wearing these pins were not gang members, but normal citizens that had paid the insurance gang to deal with all the matters today. Bang! Suddenly, a man with blonde hair got punched, and a group of 3 men jumped the guy that got punched. The man curled into a shrimp and held tightly onto something. The 3 attackers continued wailing at the helpless man, but they were careful not to break any bones. "Hand over your credits," one of them shouted. The blonde man on the ground didn't answer and kept holding onto his credits. The 3 gritted their teeth. Killing someone was forbidden, and they were also not allowed to shed any blood. However, the city wouldn't bat an eye if they broke some bones. But despite how things looked, the 3 men were not psychopaths that wanted the guy to die. If they stole his credits and broke the blonde man's bones, they would essentially kill him in the long run. One of the men grabbed the blonde guy's hair and pulled back with all his power, but the man on the ground didn't let go of his wealth. Even when his blonde hair was torn out, he didn't let go. 2 of the attackers looked at their last friend with frustrated and angry expressions. The last one took a deep breath and took hold of his victim's head. Bang! He shoved the man's head into the pavement, and he lost consciousness. Surprisingly, there was no blood, and the blonde man was still alive. This had been insanely risky. If anything went wrong, the attacking man would be killed by the city for killing another person or wasting valuable blood. A different guy bent down and wrestled a small stack of paper notes out of the blonde man's hands. After counting the paper notes, he looked at his 2 friends and nodded. Then, he handed all the notes to one of his friends, who broke into tears. The crying man hugged his 2 friends and bowed several times in gratitude in front of them. His 2 friends only assured him that it was fine. The crying man quickly ran away from the middle of the marketplace and into the arms of a woman by the side. The woman was also crying a lot. A moment later, the man let go and kneeled down as he beckoned forward. 2 young girls, not older than 8, came out from behind the woman and hugged the man. "I have enough for you," the man said with a quivering voice. Only a couple of people were watching the event. Most people were used to seeing something like this and didn't care. All the people in the marketplace just walked around the unconscious man lying in the middle of the street, treating him like just another piece of rubble. Nick had watched what had happened, but he didn't get involved. What was the point? There wasn't enough money to go around, and it was the duty of everyone to protect themselves. As more time passed, more assaults happened, but Nick just waited. And then, it was time. Everything calmed down at about 2 p.m., and the people became very quiet. By now, the entire marketplace was filled to the brim with people. No one was buying or selling anything at this moment. They all were waiting for the same thing. 2 minutes later, the sound of a gigantic swarm of insects came from one of the streets leading to the marketplace, and the sound became louder with time. Eventually, 5 people appeared in one of the streets, and they were accompanied by swarms of huge mosquitoes. The 5 people wore red uniforms with the symbol of Crimson Fungus City on them, showing their identities as people working for the city itself. Each of them carried a couple of big sacks with them, and they wore black gas masks, keeping their identities anonymous. As the 5 city agents walked down the streets, several mosquitoes split off and entered the houses they passed. They were searching for people that were trying to hide. After a while, the mosquitoes came out of the house again and returned to the 5 people as other mosquitoes entered other houses. Suddenly, an entire swarm of mosquitoes charged into one of the houses. Ah! Ah! A terrifying scream came out of the house, but it rapidly became quieter until it vanished. The swarm of mosquitoes came out of the house a couple of seconds later, and some of them flew into the sky and retreated. But just a couple of seconds later, new mosquitoes replaced the ones that had just left. After around 5 minutes, the 5 people arrived at the entrance of the marketplace. The 5 people didn't say anything for a while. Chapter 4, Zephix. A bit later, 3 people walked out of the crowd. All three of them were tall men with muscular bodies, and they were all wearing the same uniform. It looked like a military uniform painted in black with gray sleeves. This was the uniform of the insurance gang. "Welcome," the leader of the insurance gang said with a polite smile. One of the 5 city agents just extended a hand like they were asking for something. "Of course," the leader said. A moment later, he took out a suitcase, opened it, and handed it to the man. Inside the suitcase were stacks upon stacks of credits in paper form. The city agent counted the money, which took several minutes. 474, he spoke with a distorted voice. When the leader of the insurance gang heard that, he became nervous, and his smile seemed more strained. "Excuse me, but it should be 482, he said. "Could you recount, please?" 474, the city agent repeated. Silence. The leader of the insurance gang looked at the person to the right of him and gestured with his head. The guy quickly took out a couple more bills and handed them over. The city agent counted them and nodded. 482. The leader of the insurance gang also nodded. A moment later, the 3 people walked to the side. "One by one, come forward. You better not try to cheat us," the leader of the insurance gang shouted. A moment later, all the people with the black pins walked forward and passed by the 3 men from the insurance gang. The insurance gang inspected all of them and collected the black pins from everyone that passed by. By the end, 479 people had walked past them. Then, the 3 people from the insurance gang followed them, making the total 482. After that, 4 of the 5 city agents walked towards the less crowded marketplace and commanded everyone to come forward one by one. The last of them waited in the back, making sure that no one was trying to sneak by them. Next, all the people in the marketplace walked forward, handing over a stack of credits each. Nick stood up and passed through the crowd. A moment later, he stood in front of one of the people with the gas masks. Nick handed over a stack of bills and walked past them just like any other person in the marketplace. After several minutes, only around 800 people were left in the marketplace. When no one else stepped forward for several seconds, the 5th city agent stepped forward. "Last call," they shouted with a distorted voice. "Anyone not coming forward now will be considered as not able to pay. No one move." "All right," the man shouted. "As always, do not make any sudden movements, and don't show any aggression. The mosquitoes are all minions of the blood mosquito specter, and they will not drink more than what you owe." The crowd of people became scared and nervous. A moment later, the buzzing of the mosquitoes intensified, and they flew forward. The mosquitoes scattered across the crowd and started to suck the blood of the people. As time passed, mosquitoes that had filled up flew away as new ones joined. People were crying, hyperventilating, gritting their teeth and praying. Others had already grown used to it. After around 2 minutes, all the mosquitoes flew back to the 5 people in gas masks. The crowd of people had all become noticeably thinner and whiter. Lastly, the mosquitoes entered all the houses in the marketplace to make sure that no one was trying to hide. And finally, the 5 people turned around and left the marketplace behind as they walked down another street. It was over. This happened every month on the last day. Once a month, every citizen of Crimson Fungus City had to pay 100 credits to the city as tax. One could only pay the tax in full or not at all. Partial payments were not permitted. If one paid the tax, nothing would happen. But if one failed to pay the tax, they would need to pay with their blood. A group of people accompanied by large swarms of sizable mosquitoes walked through the dregs once a month. And if a citizen wasn't able to pay the tax, the swarm of mosquitoes would fall onto the citizen. The swarm of mosquitoes would gather blood until a collective 2 liters had been gathered from adults. Children below the age of 14 only needed to pay 50 credits or 1 liter of blood. Children below the age of 6 didn't need to pay taxes. Naturally, losing 2 liters of blood wasn't lethal, and the mosquitoes were excellent at not inflicting injuries on the people while gathering blood. However, recovering from something like that usually took 6 to 8 weeks. So if a citizen didn't manage to pay the tax next month as well, things would become dangerous. Getting 100 credits in 1 month was nearly impossible for normal people living in the dregs, but getting 100 credits over 2 months was manageable. Because of that, around 50% of people paid blood 1 month, credits the next, and then blood again. Of course, countless people had tried to fight their way out of paying taxes, but it always ended the same way, with the person turning into a bloodless corpse. In fact, the mosquitoes weren't accompanying the tax collectors, but the tax collectors were accompanying the mosquitoes. The tax collectors only came for two reasons. They dealt with the money, and they stopped people from panicking in front of the mosquitoes. If the mosquitoes wanted, they could kill every living person in the dregs in less than 10 minutes. One had to know that there were over 2,000 people living in the dregs. It wasn't that the mosquitoes were very powerful, but that there were literally millions of them, and every mosquito was bigger than a giant hornet. Naturally, not all of the mosquitoes accompanied the tax collectors. There were only around 100 following each tax collector, but if things became serious, millions of them would appear. Even more, the mosquitoes were the minions of a very powerful specter, the blood mosquito. The rat Nick had talked to 2 years ago was also a minion of a very powerful specter called the parasite. Some specters could control animals or create their own animals and control them. Their minions would share the perception of the specter, and the specter could also talk and act through the minions. While nearly all specters were the enemies of humanity, there were some specters that cooperated and helped humanity. The blood mosquito was one of them. The parasite was not. The blood mosquito gained power by consuming human blood. Naturally, it could send some isolated mosquitoes to gather blood from sleeping people, but if it overdid things, the truly powerful Zephyx manufacturers would notice it and kill it. So, the blood mosquito had decided to help humanity instead, and Crimson Fungus City was the perfect place. Crimson Fungus City was named after the strongest specter that was being confined inside the most prestigious Zephyx manufacturer, the Crimson Fungus. In contrast to nearly all powerful specters, the Crimson Fungus was not intelligent. As the name implied, the Crimson Fungus was just a huge fungus living inside a containment unit. Just like the blood mosquito, the Crimson Fungus gained power by absorbing human blood. But in return, the Crimson Fungus was creating electricity and, most importantly, Zephyx. Zephyx could be used for basically everything. It could be transformed into electricity, heat, movement, and so on, and it was extremely efficient at it. Even more, Zephyx could also be used to increase the powers of Zephyx extractors, and it could also be used to create powerful weapons that could deal with specters. The Crimson Fungus was the reason why the blood mosquito had chosen this city. The blood mosquito would help the Zephyx manufacturer in collecting the blood, and it would get to keep some of the blood in exchange. The remaining blood would be sprinkled onto the Crimson Fungus, which would then produce Zephyx. The Zephyx extractors would collect the Zephyx, and they would be allowed to keep a bit of it as payment. The Zephyx manufacturer would then use the harvested Zephyx to increase the power of their company or sell it to other cities. But if the Zephyx manufacturer wanted to get bigger and earn even more money, they needed even stronger specters. And to get these even stronger specters, they needed stronger Zephyx extractors. This was what Nick wanted to become. Being a Zephyx extractor meant being able to become powerful and having a better life. Nick wanted to get out of the dregs and finally live a better life. Chapter 5. Young Man. After the tax collectors left, things returned to normal in the marketplace. The anxiety of most people had been replaced with either relief or acceptance. Sadly, even though many people lost 2 liters of blood today, they couldn't go home and rest. They needed to work and earn money. Otherwise, they would need to pay with their blood again in a month. Nick returned to his usual place and continued holding up his sign. Nick trusted Albert, and he was sure that Albert wouldn't have told him to make himself noticeable if there were no point to it. Sadly, no one of note talked to Nick, and he had to go home after a while since he was getting hungry. By now, Nick was no longer living in a small cube made of metal, but in an actual house, which was also made of rusty metal. One of the richer people died recently, and his house had become available. Well, available might not be the correct word. The man died, and his son was actually now the owner of the house. The problem was that the son was only 11 years old. Naturally, the gangs wanted to take the house from the kid. But Nick went between the two sides and protected the kid. Nick would protect the kid and his inheritance. But in exchange, Nick was allowed to use their money to eat and pay his tax. Of course, the kid didn't have any other choice and accepted. After a couple of fights, the gangs decided that it wasn't worth the trouble. If Nick were just a normal guy, they would just send in like 10 guys to beat him up. But Nick actually had an active Zephix synchronizer. No one was heavily injured or dead yet, but if they escalated things might change quickly. They were certain they could take Nick down, but they were not willing to pay the price. The house wasn't worth enough since it was just a bit above average. Also, the kid had a claim on it, and the gangs couldn't get too overbearing. Smart, organized criminals knew that leading a flock of willing and happy sheep was easier than leading a flock of terrified sheep. That was also why the leader of the insurance gang had been willing to pay the difference in the taxes out of pocket. Some of his people had obviously siphoned some funds out of the collected taxes, and they would hold an internal investigation. If the leader had decided to simply hand over the 8 people with the missing cash, his insurance gang wouldn't be as trustworthy anymore, and next month they might only get like 70% of their previous customers. The insurance gang asked for 10% of the taxes as a protection and processing fee, which meant that adults would pay them 10 credits to protect their 100 credits. With about 480 customers, that came to 4,800 credits. Even when the leader paid 800 credits out of pocket, they still made a profit of 4,000 credits. If he had refused to hand over the 800 credits, they would have saved 800 credits today, but they might pay 1,500 credits in lost profits for every following month for a long time. Even though they were criminals and this was the dregs, it was still important that people were satisfied with the services provided, and waging war against someone that was protecting a vulnerable child was bad. It wasn't worth it. Of course, everything had its advantages and disadvantages. While Nick got a nice home and had no money problems anymore, he had permanently destroyed any opportunity to work for any of the gangs. For 2 weeks, Nick kept going to the marketplace to wait with his sign raised. One particular day that didn't seem different from any other. Someone approached Nick in the marketplace. It was a young but tall man with light brown hair. His hair was chaotic, but it was clean. His brown shirt and trousers were torn but just as clean. As someone that had lived in the dregs for his entire life, Nick could immediately tell that the guy in front of him was trying to act poor when he obviously wasn't. The guy probably hadn't even seen a poor person up to today. Otherwise, his disguise wouldn't be so superficial. The man walked up to Nick with a friendly smile, but Nick could see that the guy was very nervous deep inside. "Hey, you're a Zephix extractor?" the man asked as he looked at Nick's sign. "I got through the entrance exam for Ghosty's lab, but I never worked as one since my Zephix synchronizer is already attuned," Nick answered as he looked with suspicion at the guy. A small glimmer appeared in the guy's eyes when he heard that. "Your Zephix synchronizer is already attuned?" Nick nodded. Silence. The guy seemed uncertain about how to proceed with the conversation, and Nick could practically read his thoughts with how expressive his face was. Nick was quite certain that the guy was trying to find a way to get Nick to tell him more about himself without seeming like a shady person that wanted to scam him. "You know Albert?" Nick asked. The guy's eyes widened for just an instant before he smiled uncomfortably. "There are many people called Albert," he said awkwardly. "Bullshit," Nick thought. "Nobody here is called Albert except for that one guy. Black and gray hair, and he summoned a couple of things that can hover. Maybe you can fill out the last detail to make sure that we are talking about the same person," Nick said with a suspicious expression. The man blinked a couple of times. "He is fond of tools," the man added after a while. When Nick heard that, he smiled brightly. Finally, he said as he stood up, making the man move backward. "Albert told me that someone would come with a job in the near future. I guess you're the guy?" The man also became excited. Apparently, he had also expected to meet someone, but then his expression fell, and he became suspicious. "I know him, but I don't think I have the capital to hire you. I also live in the dregs," he said carefully. At that moment, the surrounding people threw incredulous looks at him as they stopped walking. The man noticed, and he felt like he had said something wrong. "Dude," Nick said, making the man turn to him, "you just said capital also, Your disguise is horrible. Nobody will believe you. If they did, they would have already shaken you down for everything you have, based on how uncertain and fearful you look." The man's smile turned more uncomfortable. "I'm not sure." "Come with me," Nick said, as he grabbed the guy's arm to pull him away. The guy looked with shock at the place where Nick was grabbing him, and for just an instant, his eyes turned pure white. But he quickly calmed down again, and his eyes turned back to normal instantaneously. He had never seen anyone that just grabbed a stranger and pulled them away. "Hey, I can walk on my own," the guy said as he pulled his arm out of Nick's grip. "Then come," Nick said, gesturing with his head to the distance. The man took out a handkerchief and cleaned the spot where Nick had touched him, and followed after him. After a couple of minutes, they arrived in front of Nick's temporary home. The man became a bit uncertain again, but he just took a deep breath and entered. Chapter 6: Wintour Melfion. When the man entered the house, he became more uncomfortable. There was dirt everywhere, and there were even several holes in the walls. If he became careless, he might even cut himself on the sharp edges of the walls. "Hey, come over," Nick shouted from one of the rooms. The man walked over and saw Nick sitting on the ground in the middle of a bigger room. There were no tables or chairs. Then, he just looked at the place in front of Nick with a questioning gaze. "Should I sit down?" "Well, duh," Nick answered with a roll of his eyes. The man took a deep breath and sat down. "Do you have anything to drink?" he asked. "The water barrel is in the back." Nick gestured to his back. "Oh, okay," the man said. "Do you have a glass or a mug?" Nick blinked slowly. "A what?" he asked. "You know, a mug," he repeated, gesturing with his hands. "A small container for liquids." Nick blinked slowly again. "Why, just drink," he said with a deadpan expression and voice. The man looked with an uncomfortable expression at Nick. "Never mind. I'm not thirsty," he said. "Silence. I'm Wintour," the man said, stretching his hand forward for a handshake. Nick looked at the hand. "What do you want?" he asked, looking at it. "A handshake and an introduction?" Wintour asked awkwardly, keeping his arm outstretched. Nick furrowed his brows and moved his own hand forward. Then, Nick grabbed Wintour's fingers and looked him in the eyes. "I'm Nick." Winter smiled uncomfortably and moved his hand up and down for a handshake, while Nick looked back at the shaking hands. "Could you please let go?" Wintour asked. Nick frowned, confused why Wintour wanted them to hold hands, and then suddenly not, but he still let go of Wintour's fingers. "Sorry, Nick, I still need to get used to how people down here act," Wintour said with an apologetic expression. Sure enough, he isn't from here, Nick thought. The fact that Wintour had said down here meant that he came from the inner city. Crimson Fungus City was comprised of two parts, the inner city and the outer city. If one were to look at Crimson Fungus City from a plane, one would see a huge city, which surrounded an absolutely enormous structure in the middle of it. The structure was a humongous curvy pyramid in the shape of a hyperbola. It was made of reflective metal and was nearly 2 kilometers high and 5 kilometers wide. Around this huge structure were many tall and expensive buildings, but the further one got away from the center, the smaller and uglier the buildings got. About 3 kilometers away from the edge of the structure was the dregs, the outermost part of the city. In the dregs were the poorest people who could barely survive. Between the dregs and the inner city was the actual outer city. Ghosty's lab was in the inner city, but the location for the exam had been in the outer city. Nick had heard legends about the inner city, but he had never been there, and he had only met 2 people that had been there. Albert and Wintour. "You're from the inner city, right?" Nick asked. "Yes, but from the lower levels," Wintour answered. "It's my first time in the dregs." "I can tell," Nick said as Wintour only smiled uncomfortably. "So why are you here?" Nick asked. "Before I tell you, I need you to sign something," Wintour said, as he took some sheets of paper from a small sack hanging from his belt. Nick looked at the first sheet of paper and furrowed his brows. "No noon disclosure agreement. Noon disclosure agreement? What's that?" Nick asked. Wintour looked with shock at Nick. "You can't read." Nick furrowed his brows. "I can read. I learned it from Albert. I'm just out of practice." Okay. Wintour answered quickly. That's a non-disclosure agreement. It means that you are not allowed to talk about any of the things I'm about to tell you to anyone else, or the city will come for you. Essentially, if you talk about my secrets, you will be a criminal. Okay, Nick said absent-mindedly as he tried to read the first sentence of the NDA, but it was far beyond difficult. Reading and understanding a legal document was already difficult for adults with a lot of money, and Nick's reading comprehension was on the level of an elementary school student. After a couple of minutes, Wintour offered to just read out everything for Nick, but Nick said he didn't trust him and that he would read it himself. 2 hours and many questions about what words meant later, Nick had finally finished reading everything. After some more instructions from Wintour, Nick awkwardly signed the bottom of the page. Nick was so confused about all of this. He knew what he had signed, but it was still so alien and strange. Okay, Wintour said with a relieved sigh. Everything we talk about from now on is subject to the NDA, which means you are not allowed to tell the contents to a third person without my consent. Do you understand? Nick nodded. My full name is Wintour Melfion, and I am the third heir to the Melfion family, Wintour said. Nick blinked a couple of times. Silence. Okay, Nick commented. Wintour took a deep breath. He had never gotten such a dismissive reaction to the revelation of his family name. My father is on the board of directors of Kugelblitz, Wintour added. Nick blinked once slowly. Okay, he said. Wintour ruffled his hair in frustration. He partially runs the city, Wintour shouted. Kugelblitz is the Zephyx manufacturer that has the crimson fungus, and my father owns 20% of Kugelblitz. Oh, Nick said in surprise. That's cool, I guess. Wintour massaged the bridge of his nose in annoyance and sighed. It's not important anyway, he said. What's important is that my father doesn't want his heirs to grow up to be useless good-for-nothings. He worked hard to get where he is now, and he wants us to do the same thing. Because of that, he instructed all of his children to build a Zephyx manufacturer company and earn enough to buy 0.05% of Kugelblitz. Otherwise, we don't get to use our family's resources, Wintour explained. 0.05%, Nick asked. How much is that? Like 1,000 credits? Wintour snorted. More like 50 million. Nick's eyes shot open in shock. 50 million credits? Wait. And Wintour's father owned 20% of that company. How much money was that? Wintour smirked when he saw that Nick was finally surprised by his background. Anyway, he said, in comparison to my siblings, I refuse to get taken advantage of by the Zephyx manufacturers in the inner city and came out here where there is basically zero competition. I need a Zephyx extractor to get my business off the ground. And since I don't have a Spectre, I can't just recruit normal people. I need someone that already has an attuned Zephyx synchronizer. Albert told me that I would find someone meeting my criteria in the central marketplace of the dregs, and that's why we are here now. By now, Wintour's anxiety and uncertainty in his demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a competent, direct, and charismatic businessman. I want to employ you as my chief Zephyx extractor, and the first thing we need is to capture a Spectre. Chapter 7. Spectres. I'm in, Nick immediately answered. Wintour was a bit taken aback. That was quick, he said with a couple of blinks. Don't you want to know anything about your job? Salary? Duties? Is it worse than my current situation? Nick asked. Wintour glanced around the broken and dirty home. Even though this was one of the bigger houses in the dregs, it was still in horrendous condition. The chances of death are rather high, Wintour commented. After all, you have to interact with specters. Nick nodded. So I gotta beat some specters up. No big deal. Wintour furrowed his brows in skepticism. Do you even know what a specter is? Powerful animals or humans with some abilities, right? Nick asked casually. As long as I can punch them, they can die, right? Wintour took a deep breath and sighed. That's true for some of them, but that is not the majority, he answered. Do you know what Zephyx is? Stuff we get from specters, Nick answered with a confident nod. Yes, but what is it? Wintour asked with another sigh. Silence. Energy? Nick asked with uncertainty. Wintour just snorted. That's a cop-out answer. You can say everything is energy, and you wouldn't be wrong. Have you ever heard of prefix? Prefix? The stuff you put before words? Nick asked. No, prefix, spelled P-R-E-P-H-Y-X, not P-R-E-F-I-X. It's like Zefix, but with pre instead of Z. Nick shook his head. All right, Wintour said with a bit of annoyance. Let me just give you a quick rundown of how the world actually works. Nick nodded and listened to Wintour. Prefix is an invisible force of energy that exists all over the world. It can only be detected by very advanced equipment and by very powerful extractors. Prefix has an incredible amount of energy stored inside of it. Sadly, we can't access the prefix in the atmosphere. We simply don't have any means to actually make use of the energy stored inside the prefix. When the prefix in the atmosphere gains a certain level of density, it can create a specter. A specter is something that can transform prefix into zefix, which is a usable form of prefix. A specter is not necessarily alive, and it is not necessarily intelligent. Additionally, specters are unique, which means that there is only one specter of any kind in the world. There are never two or more specters that are identical. In general, specters appear in one of three different forms, but there can be exceptions. 1. A force specter. A force specter can be an intelligent or non-intelligent being that consists of forms of energy. For example, the specter we call the fog is a formless cloud of something that mimics fog. It is unintelligent and only follows its basic instinct. From time to time, it wanders through some parts of the city and engulfs someone. That person will then wander aimlessly in the fog until they die of starvation. You can't feel the fog. You can't punch the fog. You can't run out of the fog. If it catches you, you will die unless you are a strong Zefix extractor that has equipment and abilities based on Zefix. Is the fog still around? Nick asked. Wintour laughed bitterly. Have you forgotten what I said earlier? When prefix reaches a certain density, a specter can appear. Something like the fog is extremely difficult to contain. Additionally, it only consumes about one human every month. The fog is a level 2 specter, which makes it stronger than the most common specters, but it only consumes one human every month. Now, if we were to kill it, its energy would disperse into the atmosphere again, and we would quickly find a couple more level 1 specters in the world, and chances are that they will cost more human lives than the fog. Wait, Nick shouted, but can't we just store all the Zefix of the fog after killing it? Surprisingly, Wintour nodded. We can, but it doesn't change anything. What? Nick asked in surprise. Wintour nodded again. Naturally, when we kill a specter, we store all their energy, but it doesn't change anything. If we ignore all the energy and let it disperse, a couple of level 1 specters will appear. If we store all the energy and don't let it disperse, a couple of level 1 specters will still appear. No matter what we do, killing a specter will always result in the creation of more, weaker specters. Nick looked at the ground with a worried expression. That was troublesome. This meant that they couldn't possibly get rid of the specters. Wintour noticed Nick's crestfallen expression. It's not as hopeless as you think. Nick looked at Wintour. Humanity's ultimate plan for survival is to contain every single specter in the world without killing them. If we can do that, all the specters would essentially become irrelevant since they wouldn't be a danger anymore, Wintour explained. Nick furrowed his brows again. That sounds difficult. There are probably a lot of specters. Oh, the numbers aren't the problem, Wintour said casually. You have no idea how powerful extractors can become. The issue isn't the number, but the power of the specters. Please remember that everything we are talking about is subject to the NDA. If you tell anyone else about it, your life will essentially be forfeit. Nick nodded. Wintour nodded back. Specters are categorized into different levels of power. Every new specter starts at level 1. This makes them more powerful than every normal human. But people with an attuned Zefix synchronizer can fight them. Specters and extractors can both become more powerful. The strongest Zefix extractors that exist are level 8, and we have a single-digit number of them. However, there is a 2-digit number of level 8 specters in the world. Nick looked with shock at Wintour, and then Nick remembered something he had witnessed several times by now. What about Nurse Alice? He asked. Everyone knew about Nurse Alice. Everyone in the dregs had seen Nurse Alice. and everyone knew that Nurse Alice was a specter. Wintour sighed. Nurse Alice is one of the 5 level 9 specters. Nick took a deep breath. There are exactly 5 level 9 specters in the world, and even if all of humanity banded together, we wouldn't be able to stop even a single one of them. Nurse Alice is probably the most damaging specter in the entire world. She kills hundreds and sometimes even thousands of humans every single day. But her power is so great that nobody can do anything against her. She does whatever she wants, and we can do nothing but watch. And there are 4 more like her. Chapter 8. Kill the Sun. Nick thought back to the last time he had seen Nurse Alice. It was a bit more than 2 months ago. The people had gathered in the marketplace to pay their blood tax, and a man had just stolen all the credits of a frail young woman. It had been quite obvious that she had already paid with her blood for the last or even the last 2 times. After she had lost her credits, she just looked at the ground with a dead expression. And then, she had uttered the sentence, "I wish I were dead." At that moment, the marketplace fell silent. Everyone knew what it meant to say the sentence. A minute later, a girl with a bright and kind smile walked into the marketplace. She looked like she was in her late teens, and she wore a clean pink nurse's outfit. No one dared to stand in her way, and even though the marketplace was filled to the brim, the people still managed to make a wide road for the kindly smiling nurse. The nurse walked over to the woman, who was still kneeling in the middle of the marketplace. The woman looked up when the nurse stopped in front of her. The nurse just kindly smiled at her. "I'm Nurse Alice, and I'm here because you called me," she said with a kind and empathetic tone. "Just calm down. It will be over soon, and you won't feel any pain or discomfort." The woman looked at the ground again. A moment later, Nurse Alice kneeled down beside her and slowly moved her right palm over the woman's eyes, like someone that was closing the opened eyes of a corpse. When she had closed her eyes, the woman had already died. Nurse Alice gently laid the corpse on the ground and stood up with a kind smile. A moment later, she vanished from the marketplace. If anyone in the world uttered something akin to, "I wish I were dead," "I want to die," "Just kill me," "I don't want to live anymore," or anything similar to that, Nurse Alice would appear and grant that wish. It didn't matter whether the person wanted it or not. After uttering the sentence, Nurse Alice would kill them. Even if the sentence were said as a joke, it didn't matter. If anyone for any reason uttered something akin to the sentence, Nurse Alice would arrive and end their life. Have you ever said anything like that in your life? Maybe when a loved one died. Maybe when your head was hanging in the toilet after too much drinking. Maybe when something really embarrassing happened. The occasion didn't matter. As long as anyone said it, Nurse Alice would arrive. "And she's only one of the 5 level 9 specters?" Nick asked. Wintour nodded. 3 of the level 9 specters are unmissable. I can guarantee you that almost everyone has seen the 3 of them in their life before. Do you know the other 2? Nick quickly nodded. "I know one of them. It's the one that resides in the darkness." "Correct," Wintour said. "The nightmare is one of the 5 level 9 specters, and it is omnipresent in all the dark places in the world. The darker the place, the stronger its influence." Nick remembered one of the many times he had encountered the nightmare. Nick had once been searching for food, which was why he had walked into the sewers. Luckily, the ceiling of the sewers was mostly made of grates, which meant that the omnipresent sun could also illuminate them. However, there had been some dark corridors in the sewers as well, and whenever Nick walked through them, he heard the whispers. Human voices appeared in the darkness, telling Nick that everyone was trying to kill him, and that nobody cared whether he lived or died. The whispers were trying to fill Nick's mind with paranoia, depression, self-doubt, hatred, anger, and every other kind of negative emotion. They wanted to warp Nick into a different person. Luckily, the dark corridors hadn't been that dark and long, which made it possible for him to quickly get through them and find a rat to eat. The existence of the nightmare was also the reason why many newly built houses in the dregs purposefully created several holes in the ceiling and walls. Being in the darkness was extremely dangerous, which was why everyone avoided being in dark places. The nightmare and Nurse Alice were so powerful that it didn't matter where someone was. Their influence extended across the entire world. "Do you also know of the third one?" Wintour asked. Nick thought about the question for a while, but eventually he just shook his head. Surprisingly, Wintour said, "The third one is the most conspicuous of all." Then, Wintour pointed up. Nick looked up and saw that Wintour was pointing at a hole in the ceiling, and Nick could see the sun through that hole. "It's the sun," Wintour said. Nick's eyes widened. "The sun? Wait, the sun is a specter? Surprising, right?" Wintour commented. Nick just nodded. "We have managed to somewhat calculate and understand the powers of the other 4 level 9 specters. But when it comes to the sun, we are essentially still blind. It is everywhere all the time. Anyone that flies above a certain height immediately ceases to exist. Everyone sees the sun exactly above them at all times. It doesn't matter on which side of the planet you are. The sun is always at the same spot for everyone individually. And most shocking of all, its light is real. The entire world is illuminated by its light. It has the power to illuminate the entire world at the same time without having to take a break. The sheer amount of energy that requires is incomprehensible. All of humanity agrees that the sun is the most powerful specter that exists in the world, and it is the biggest obstacle standing between humanity and freedom. If humanity ever wants to achieve freedom, there's only a single thing we need to do: kill the sun." Chapter 9, Null. Nick just looked with shock at Wintour. Kill the sun? How? How could a human destroy something as powerful as the sun? What would even happen after it was destroyed? Of course, Wintour added, all of that is far in the future, and we might not witness it in our lifetime. Nick looked at the hole in the ceiling again. In the last couple of minutes, the world had become much bigger to him. Until now, Nick had just wanted to get a good job to live a better life. But now he had heard about so many grand things. Humanity was several times weaker than the collective specters. Nick only sighed. Nick had seen horrible things in the dregs, and he wanted to change the world. Surprisingly, Nick's issue wasn't with the gangs or the robbers, but with the system. The people simply did what they could to survive. If there were enough to go around, people might not kill each other as much. Sure, greed would always be present, but it wouldn't be so overwhelming. Sadly, Nick knew that he was just one man. He couldn't change anything. So, the next best thing was to live a good life without having to compromise his moral compass. If he had the power to change things, he would, but he didn't, and he most likely never will. After a couple of seconds of silence, Nick sighed. What about the other 2? The fourth one is the maw, Wintour explained. The maw is not something that the majority of people will ever come into contact with, since it exclusively interacts with Zephix extractors. From time to time, it grabs a group of extractors and forces them to fight each other until only a single one survives, who is then allowed to leave. Nick sighed. And there's nothing we can do? Wintour just shook his head. What about the last one? Nick asked. Wintour looked a bit troubled and furrowed his brows. The last one is difficult to talk about since it is rather special. No one knows what it looks like, and no one knows where it is, but the effects of its existence are indisputable. Wintour looked up at the sun through the hole. In a way, it's the opposite of the sun. Everyone's attention is fixed on the sun, almost like it is afraid of not being seen by everyone in the world. The 5th level 9 specter is the opposite. It's like it doesn't dare to show itself. No one is allowed to know what it looks, sounds, tastes, smells, or feels like. There have been cases in which some powerful extractors analyzed all the scattered clues of its existence. Wintour looked at the ground with a troubled expression. One day that group died, and all their findings were destroyed along with them. Then, Wintour looked at Nick. But interestingly enough, nothing else was damaged. Only the things relevant to it had been destroyed. Due to the manner of its existence, we call it null. Null, Nick repeated with a shocked voice. Wintour just raised an eyebrow. Why are you so surprised? Specters have strange abilities. Nick looked at the ground. After a bit, he looked at his hands with an unsure expression. I think I understand now, he said. That's why Albert was so interested in me. Wintour looked with quite some interest at Nick. Do tell. Nick looked at Wintour. I think I've seen Null before. For just an instant, Wintour was taken aback, but he quickly became skeptical. If you did, you would be dead. Nick slowly shook his head. I think I have seen it before, but I do not know what it looks, smells, tastes, sounds, or feels like. Wintour blinked several times. What? He asked in confusion. I have amnesia, Nick said. I don't remember anything from before I was 10. My earliest memory is waking up in a room in a random house in the dregs. I lived in the house for a couple of days, but some people came in and threw me onto the streets. Wintour looked with intensity at Nick. And what makes you believe that you have seen Null? My attuned Zephix synchronizer, Nick said. It has been attuned ever since I remember. Speaking of, Wintour said, I need to know what kind of ability you have. Can you show me? Nick laughed helplessly. That's the thing. It's impossible. I can't show you my ability. Wintour's expression became skeptical. Then, how am I supposed to believe that you even have one? I have one, but I can't show you, Nick said. Explain, Wintour said. I can only use my ability when no one can see me, Nick explained. When no one can see me, I can move about 5 times faster, and my body is several times stronger. Wintour rubbed his chin in thought. That is a very substantial increase in power. Can you prove your ability in some way? Nick remembered the time he had fixed the hole in the ground by breaking part of a house and nodded. Follow me, Nick said as he walked out of the house. Wintour followed Nick, and the two of them stopped beside a ruin of a house. After a bit of testing, Nick found an iron plate that had been bolted onto 2 stable beams. No normal human could get the iron plate off the beams without tools. Wait on this side, Nick said as he walked to the other side. Wintour waited with raised eyebrows. Boom! Wintour's eyes shot open in shock as he saw a big dent appear on the iron plate. Boom! Another huge dent appeared after an explosive sound. That enough? Nick asked as he walked out from behind the plate. Wintour still had difficulties believing Nick. What if Nick had prepared some kind of contraption that he could quickly hide after using it? Wintour wanted to test Nick some more. But after several minutes of different kinds of tests, Wintour could only accept that what Nick was claiming was the truth. As they returned to the house, Wintour thought about Nick's ability, and when they sat down again, Wintour had only one question. How can you use that ability against an opponent? As soon as you enter a fight with anyone, you effectively lose all your power. Nick smiled uncomfortably. I have no idea. Chapter 10. Everything prepared. Inside the house, the two of them returned to talking. Wintour and Nick talked about Nick's duties and the plans of development for their Zephix manufacturing company. Wintour also told Nick about the 2 remaining categories of specters since they had gotten sidetracked earlier. The first one was a force specter, which represented a specter in the form of something untouchable. The fog had been used as an example. The second kind of specter was a physical specter. As the name suggested, a physical specter had a physical body. The body could be an animal, a human, a plant, an item, and so on. For example, the crimson fungus was a physical specter. It could be touched, and it could be injured by a strong physical force, while something like the fog couldn't be injured by a physical force, even though the fog was vastly inferior to the crimson fungus. Lastly, there were possession specters. These were specters that did not have their own bodies. Instead, they took control over a living or non-living entity. For example, Ghosty's lab had once essentially won the lottery by finding the glasses, which was a possession specter. The glasses was a level 2 specter, and it simply looked like a pair of glasses. If anyone put on the glasses, their reality would slightly warp in very inconspicuous ways. Over a long enough period of time, the wearer would become insane. But that was it. As long as one knew what was going on, it wouldn't be a big issue. And to top it all off, the glasses produced Zephix as long as someone wore them. It didn't endanger anyone. It didn't attempt to escape. It was easy to get Zephix from it. It was the perfect specter for Zephix manufacturers. Naturally, Wintour and Nick wanted to get a possession specter for their business, but finding one depended on luck and resources. The two of them wouldn't even be able to do anything against a force specter since they didn't have any Zephix equipment yet. Without equipment made of Zephix, it was impossible to interact with force specters. Even worse, Force specters were notorious for being hard to contain, since most of them could just pass through walls. Containing a force specter needed a highly advanced containment unit made of many different materials made of Zephyx. In the end, they were left with going after a physical specter, but that came with its own challenges. First, even a level 1 specter was something that every Zephyx manufacturer wanted, even the really big ones. Specters were very rare, and all the big Zephyx manufacturers had people dedicated to finding clues about possible specters. Then Nick also had to contain them, and lastly, he could only attempt to get a level 1 specter. A level 2 specter was too powerful for a new Zephyx extractor like Nick. The rat that had tried to convince Nick to kill himself had once said that Nick had met 2 specters. Yet, Nick hadn't been able to see the specters. To Nick, it had been like he had never seen any specters, which meant that the specters had been either invisible or mixed among the crowd of people. Surprisingly, Nick didn't doubt the rat's words. After all, he knew who the rat was. In fact, everyone knew about the rats. The rats were the minions of a very powerful specter called the Parasite. The Parasite was located somewhere in the wilderness, and nobody had seen it before. In order to get human corpses, the Parasite took control of a huge swarm of rats and sent them into the city. Through its minions, it could interact with and sense the entire city. And when someone was suicidal or depressed, one of the rats would walk out and try to convince that person to kill themselves. While the Parasite was very powerful, its rats weren't very powerful, and forcefully attacking someone with a swarm of rats had proven to be very inefficient. Because of that, the Parasite tried to convince people to kill themselves without uttering the sentence. Despite everything, Nurse Alice wasn't the biggest fan of having the corpses of her clients defiled, which was why the Parasite didn't dare to consume the corpse of someone that had uttered the sentence. Nevertheless, the Parasite was very powerful, and it could probably find all kinds of specters in the city. Sadly, it was impossible to work with the Parasite, otherwise it would already be working with one of the bigger Zephyx manufacturers. Eventually, Wintour and Nick ironed out all the details, and their working relationship was set in stone. Wintour was the owner, CEO, clerk, recruiter, and administrator of the company. Essentially, he was dealing with everything that wasn't related to interacting with specters. Nick was the chief Zephyx extractor, information gatherer, and security officer. In short, Wintour was the brains, and Nick was the muscles. Wintour also showed Nick the place he had bought for their company. In the western edge of the dregs, just a little bit before the actual city, Wintour had bought a big warehouse. In comparison to all the buildings in the dregs, the warehouse actually wasn't made of rusty metal. Instead, it just looked plain. Inside, the warehouse had been completely emptied except for one thing. In the center of the warehouse was a steel cuboid, 5 by 5 by 3 meters big. This was one of the cheapest containment units available, but it already cost a ridiculous sum to get one. According to Wintour, this containment unit had cost him over 200,000 credits. It was made of extremely hard steel, and the walls were over 30 centimeters thick. Nick even wanted to try if he could escape from it, but the walls were so hard that even he was helpless. This kind of cheap containment unit could safely contain a level 1 physical and possession specter, but it wouldn't work against force specters. Even more, level 2 physical specters would have enough power to slowly chip away at the containment unit until it broke. When Nick heard that, he realized how powerful a level 2 specter actually was. A level 2 specter could break through this insanely solid room of metal. Eventually, everything had been prepared. They had a containment unit. They had an administrator. They had a Zephyx extractor. Now, they were only missing the last piece, a specter. As Nick walked back onto the streets, he just awkwardly scratched the back of his head. I have no idea where I can find one. Chapter 11. Where to start? Nick had no idea where to start. Everything had been prepared, and now they only needed a specter. But where could they even get a specter from? The big Zephyx manufacturers had several people searching for specters at any given time, while Nick was basically alone. Sure, there was also Wintour, but it wasn't his job to find and capture specters. Should I search for a specter with minions? I mean, I know about the blood mosquito and the parasite, but both of them are too powerful. Wait, do weak specters even have minions? Or does that require a lot more power? Nick just scratched the back of his head as he stood in front of the warehouse. There are 3 kinds of specters, and I can't even attempt to get any force specters. That only leaves possession specters and physical specters. I really doubt that I would easily find a possession specter since the Zephix manufacturers love those. At least that was what Wintour said. That means I have to find a physical specter. But where? Nick scratched the side of his head. I mean, I heard the outside is basically filled with specters, but everybody knows that the outside is extremely dangerous. Level 2 specters are already able to damage the walls of the containment unit, while I can't even make a dent in them. Obviously, level 3 specters would be even more powerful. I don't think going outside of the city would be a smart idea. Nick sighed. Guess that means I'm stuck searching for a physical specter inside the city. Nick still scratched the side of his head. The next moment, he turned towards the direction of the dregs. Maybe I should just start asking around. After a couple of seconds, Nick just shrugged and walked towards the dregs. Sure, why not? Wintour looked through one of the windows at Nick, who was walking away. I hope he finds one, Wintour thought with furrowed brows. And I also hope the one he finds isn't too strong. After a while, Nick's surroundings became dirtier and dirtier, making him feel like he had come back home. The outer city had been a bit too clean for Nick. It almost felt unnatural. Eventually, Nick reached the marketplace where he had sat for months with his sign. Today was not tax day, which meant that the marketplace was quite normal. People were talking with each other, but still keeping a safe distance. After all, everyone could potentially be dangerous in the dregs. Nick scratched the side of his head again. Eventually, someone just so happened to meet Nick's eyes, and Nick walked towards them. The person Nick was walking to was a thin adult man who seemed like he regretted accidentally meeting Nick's eyes right now. Hey, Nick said with a friendly tone, I'm searching for a specter. Near the beginning, the man seemed annoyed and uninterested, but when he heard the word specter, he became nervous. A specter? Which one? He asked with worry. I don't really know, Nick said with uncertainty. This confused the man. What? But you just said you were searching for one. I mean, yeah, Nick answered with an awkward laugh. You see, I'm a new Zephix extractor, and I'm searching for my first specter, you know. When the man heard that, he calmed down a bit. But then, he became angry. Then stop talking like you lost a specter. I thought I was in danger or something, he shouted. Yes, sorry and stuff, Nick said as he tried to sound nice. So, you got any hints? No, the man answered with annoyance. And even if I had any, why would I give them to you? I would just tell the investigators. At least they would give me enough money for the next couple of payments. Nick could only sigh. The investigators were people who worked for Zephix manufacturers, and their job was to find clues about specters. Naturally, a couple of Zephix manufacturers had already opened some kind of service point where the residents of the city could give them clues regarding specters. And Nick? What did Nick have to offer? Literally nothing. Thanks anyway, Nick said with a sigh. The man snorted when he heard Nick. Apparently, he was still a bit angry about the scare Nick had given him. Nick left the man behind and went to a clerk from one of the stalls. That clerk basically said the same thing. He was annoyed that Nick was wasting his time with useless talk and told Nick that he would just go to the investigators if he had some clues. After asking a couple more people, Nick realized that there was really basically nothing he could gain from talking to the people. They would all just contact the investigators because of the money. Sure, Nick could probably ask Wintour for some money to pay the people, but how many people would actually trust Nick's words? And more importantly, how many of the clues would actually lead to specters? After over 2 hours of asking around, Nick still hadn't found a clue regarding a specter. Eventually, Nick just decided to patrol. The people were of no help anyway. Nick walked through several small and remote alleyways, and the floor became more and more unstable. The dregs were way too big for the number of people that lived here. The issue was the amount of money in circulation and the available food. Theoretically, if 2 people lived in one house, just this part of the dregs could hold over 10,000 people. Yet, there were barely 2,000. Because of that, there were plenty of abandoned places in the dregs. Usually, there was no point in going there. Everything worthwhile had already been looted and stolen, while specters hunted humans, which meant that they were also more likely to be amongst humans. And the abandoned dregs basically didn't have any humans. Yet Nick was already out of options, and this was the best thing he could do right now. Maybe a specter had its nest and hiding place in the abandoned parts, and only went amongst humans when they were hungry. Hey. When Nick heard that voice, his brows furrowed. "What do you want?" Nick asked in annoyance as he looked at one of the broken plates of rusty metal. A moment later, the small head of a rat poked out of a hole in the plate. "I heard you were searching for a weak specter," the rat said with a grin. "I am," Nick said. Naturally, Nick knew exactly who he was talking to right now. The parasite. The specter that tried to convince him to kill himself. "I know of a couple," the rat said with a chuckle. "Interested?" Nick raised one of his eyebrows. "I am," he said after some hesitation. "All right," the rat said with a grin. "I want 5 bodies. Bring me 5 bodies that have not been killed by Nurse Alice, and I will tell you where you can find a fitting one." Chapter 12, Morals. Nick scratched his chin for a bit. The rat looked with interest at Nick. "Not interested," Nick said after a bit. "Oh, come on," the rat shouted, but it still didn't dare to leave its little hole. "It's just 5 bodies. You don't even need to kill them yourself." "No, killing is forbidden," Nick answered. "So?" the rat asked. "Who cares?" "I do," Nick said. "I'm a real Zephix extractor now. I can't do such shady stuff." The rat blinked very slowly. "What?" it asked in a disbelieving and deadpan voice. "Extractors kill the most people. They can basically kill whoever they want. They just need to pay a fine for it." Nick scratched the back of his head. "I mean, I get it, but I don't like it. It feels dirty." The rat looked like it couldn't believe what Nick was saying. "What are you talking about? I literally saw you kill that guy from the insurance gang and dump his body in the ruins," the rat shouted. "Ruins?" Nick asked. "The sewers. The stuff below the grates you're walking on," the rat shouted with annoyance. "Oh, that," Nick said. "Yeah, I killed him, but that was because he was trying to collect information on me. It was self-defense." "Self-defense? The guy was just looking at your house. You punched his face in before he could even do anything." "Yeah, like I said, self-defense," Nick answered with annoyance. "He went against me, and I answered in kind." The rat scratched on the grate below it with annoyance. "Okay, fine, it was self-defense, then go out and make some enemies and self-defend yourself into 5 corpses." "No," Nick answered. Silence. "Why?" the rat asked. "I don't want to kill people that haven't done anything to me." "I have morals, you know," Nick shouted with a serious tone. "Morals," the rat repeated with annoyance. "Yes, morals," Nick answered. "Okay," the rat said. "Then go purchase 5 corpses or something. Your employer looks like he has money." "Can't," Nick answered. "We are not allowed to keep the corpses. Also, I heard that the entire city is basically looking for you. And if anyone found out that I purchased some corpses to hand them to you, the city would probably kill me." The rat took a deep breath. Okay, it said. "Anyway, my offer still stands. If you are ever interested in some information, just give me some corpses. I don't care where they come from. As long as they are human and have not been killed by Nurse Alice, I am fine with any. Anyway, good luck finding a specter without me," the rat said with a snort before it vanished back into its hole. When Nick heard that, he furrowed his brows again and scratched the back of his head. He really didn't like his current situation. Just now, the parasite had given him a chance to find a specter, but he had declined. In the end, Nick could only sigh and accept his circumstances. Of course, as someone who had lived in the dregs for his entire life, Nick was a very practical person. Naturally, he had considered the parasite's offer seriously. However, no matter how he reasoned with himself, Nick just couldn't accept helping the parasite. The parasite was a specter that killed a great number of humans. Essentially, it was preying on the weak. Over the years, Nick had looked at the huge pyramid that symbolized the inner city countless times, and whenever he saw the difference between it and the dregs, he felt very similar. Just based on how the tax system worked, Nick could tell that the rich Zephyx manufacturers in the inner city were preying on the weak and poor people of the dregs. This created a certain hatred for people who preyed on weaker ones. If everyone could just give a little of their belongings, there wouldn't be so many dying people in the dregs. Naturally, Nick knew that this was a very Nave ideology. Something like this would never happen. Yet, even if the ideology was Nave, it was still what Nick wished for. Nick couldn't change the world, but he could live his own life after his own standards at least. And Nick wouldn't take advantage of the weak people, taking advantage of the ones in power. Like the gangs, sure, but not of the weak ones. Would it be easier to just accept how the world was and go with the flow? Of course, but I don't need things to be easy, Nick thought. I'm strong enough to have morals. Nevertheless, Nick threw one last glance at the hole where the rat had just been. He felt a bit of regret. Someone with Nick's knowledge and strength could probably find 5 corpses without being found. But in the end, Nick just couldn't do it. So Nick just continued walking through the alleyways. Eventually, the metal below Nick's feet became so unstable that he had to stop. By now, Nick was pretty close to the huge wall around the city. Rows upon rows of silver cameras lined the top of the walls, and they were looking in and out of the city. Naturally, several cameras were also pointing at Nick at the moment. However, that wasn't anything unusual. After a bit, Nick just turned around and left this part of the dregs again. Nick looked for a different abandoned part and continued his search there. Hours passed. Still nothing. Nick returned home, ate something, and went to bed. The next day, he continued searching. Nothing. The next day, he went and talked to different people all day. Nobody had anything of value to say. Nick also met an investigator that day who only laughed at Nick. The investigators had already found out that Nick was searching for specters, and apparently, Nick had become a joke within their ranks. They found it quite hilarious that some unknown guy from the dregs was searching for specters while he was up against several huge companies with hundreds of employees. Nick didn't talk to the investigator. Another day passed. Another day passed. Another day passed. Nothing. Nick found absolutely nothing. Yet Nick didn't give up. He still continued searching. There had to be something, somewhere. If Nick didn't find something, his future would become gray and empty again. Nick wanted to make something of his life, and for that to happen, he needed to find something. He wouldn't give up, no matter how long it took. Chapter 13, Job Offer. Nick kept going to the marketplace and asking people for several days. By now, many people were already telling him that they knew nothing before he could even ask his questions. Constantly getting rejected by everyone didn't feel great, but Nick knew that he had to keep at it. There had to be some weak specters somewhere in the city. Of course, the inspectors also kept ridiculing Nick. Yet Nick never truly reacted to the ridicule. He just kept on asking around and searching. 10 days after Nick had started searching, some small things started to change. The people had assumed a more neutral stance instead of directly telling Nick to go away. On top of that, the inspectors actually stopped making fun of Nick. The reason for that was that the inspectors were actually a bit impressed by Nick's grit. Not many people could continue doing something after getting shut down by literally everyone around them. Another 2 days later, one of the inspectors actually stopped in front of Nick. It was a middle-aged man with black hair and a goatee. His build could be described as athletic. He wasn't thin, but he also wasn't fat. "Nick, right?" the inspector asked. Nick just furrowed his brows and walked past the inspector. "Hey, wait a minute. I'm not here to ridicule you," the inspector shouted. Nick turned around and looked at the inspector with a raised eyebrow. "I've heard from my people that you have been searching for a specter for about 2 weeks, the inspector said. "They are talking quite a lot about you. Near the beginning, it was mostly jokes and ridicule, but by now, quite a few of them actually admire your tenacity." Nick just nodded. "Thanks. Is there anything else?" The eyebrows of the inspector rose, but the next second he just chuckled a bit in amusement. So curt and off-putting. "Well, you are from the dregs, after all." Nick didn't like the condescending tone of the inspector and just turned around to walk away. The inspector just chuckled a bit. Want a job? Nick stopped walking, and his brows furrowed as he turned back to look at the inspector. A job? Yes, as an inspector, the inspector said. Even though you don't know the nuances of finding clues of specters, your tenacity and grit are commendable. Teaching someone how to do something isn't difficult. Teaching them how to gain tenacity and grit is. I'm offering you a position as an inspector in my team, the man said. Interested? Naturally, Nick was interested. Sure. He had already signed a contract with Wintor Melfion, but his relationship with Wintor was strictly business. I already have an attuned Zephix synchronizer. Is there a way for me to become a Zephix extractor in the future? Nick asked. The inspector's eyes rose, and he looked at Nick again. Only now did the inspector take conscious note of Nick's formidable muscles. He had heard that Nick was a new Zephix extractor, but after looking more closely at the business Nick was in, the inspector could just shake his head. There were only 2 people in there, and one of them was Nick. They didn't even have a specter. In essence, Nick wasn't even an official Zephix extractor at this point. After all, he hadn't extracted even 1 unit of Zephix. There were several people in the dregs with attuned Zephix synchronizers. There were not many, but there were definitely over 10. It wasn't unusual for someone to come into contact with a specter. Yet none of these people could become actual Zephix extractors. It took way more than just that. So, the inspector hadn't considered Nick special. But after meeting Nick face to face, the inspector realized that Nick actually didn't seem weak. He had tenacity, a strong body, guts, and willpower. He could actually become a Zephix extractor. Sadly, the inspector could only sigh. While it happens occasionally, inspectors don't often become extractors, and the few ones that do don't have attuned synchronizers. I can't make the decision on that, but based on my personal experience, I would say the chances are very low. Sorry. Nick furrowed his brows and looked at the ground. Even though Nick had just essentially heard that he wouldn't become a Zephix extractor, he was still a bit tempted to accept the offer. What was Nick's goal in life? Right now, Nick only wanted to have a nice future. He didn't want to worry about money. He didn't want to constantly be on guard because somebody might break into his house to kill him. Nick just wanted an easier and more colorful life. Nick knew that an inspector didn't come close to an extractor in terms of payment and status, but it was a solid job, at least. That was something that no one living in the dregs could claim to have. While the lowest-ranking inspectors didn't live in the inner city, they definitely could live in the actual outer city. Normal houses, normal food, normal work. It was already a major step up from living in the dregs. And yet, I'm sorry, Nick said with a sigh. I can't accept. Can you tell me why? The inspector asked. I don't exactly know why, Nick answered. I only know that I want to give life my best shot. I actually want to see if I can capture a specter and become a real Zephix extractor. If I don't try, I will forever regret it. And if I fail, I can still accept, right? It's not like this is only a one-time offer, Nick explained. The inspector sighed. No, it isn't. Naturally, if you want the position, just tell any of the local inspectors. Nick nodded. Then, thank you for the offer and for understanding. I'm genuinely sorry that I can't accept at this moment. The inspector nodded. No problem, he said. Then have a good one, Nick said as he turned around to walk away. As the inspector watched Nick turn around, he seemed to struggle with something. It was like an inner conflict was currently taking place in the inspector's mind. For a while, the inspector just looked at Nick. When he saw Nick walk up to a person he had already asked twice in the last 10 days, the inspector sighed again. Nick, come over here, he said, waving Nick over. Nick stopped and looked back at the inspector. After a bit, Nick turned around and walked up to the inspector. Yes, he asked. The inspector scratched the side of his head with a bitter smile. How important is this to you? The inspector asked. Nick furrowed his brows. Pretty important. It's my life, you know. How good are you in dark places? The inspector asked. Nick looked to the side. The nightmare, one of the 5 level 9 specters, was omnipresent, and whenever anyone entered a dark place, the nightmare would start to poison their minds with doubt, hatred, anger, and all manners of negative emotions. Everyone avoided the dark. It's difficult to resist, Nick answered. Can you survive for an hour without any major trauma? The inspector asked. Nick furrowed his brows again. He didn't answer for a while. Not sure. The inspector looked at Nick with concern for a couple of seconds. But then he sighed. I know where you can find a specter, and it shouldn't be that powerful. Chapter 14, The Dreamer. Nick and the inspector walked to the side into an abandoned alleyway. Nick was highly interested in what the inspector had to say. After nearly 2 weeks, Nick had finally found a clue. When they arrived in the alleyway, Nick just nodded at the inspector. The inspector looked around. I am not supposed to tell you about this, the inspector said. Information regarding specters is top secret. Why are you telling me? Nick asked. Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, I feel like I should help you a bit. I kind of feel bad for you when I see you try this desperately to find a specter. 2. The specter isn't being hunted by the manufacturers anyway. This means that nobody would really miss it. And third, I don't fully agree with my employer's goal, the inspector explained. Their goal? Nick asked. The inspector nodded. There are many specters that we know about but don't capture. There are multiple reasons for that. Sometimes it's incredibly difficult to find the actual location of the specters. The parasite is a good example. The entire city is after the parasite, but nobody managed to track it down. Another reason is that some of the specters are incredibly difficult to contain, and it's even more difficult to keep them contained. While there are containment units that can keep some force specters contained, there are still some of them that can't be contained. For example, outside the city is a specter we call the Swallowing Swamp. It's just a huge swamp that's several kilometers wide. In order to contain that, we would need to commit monumental amounts of resources to it, which wouldn't be worth it. Some specters are also just too powerful. Nurse Alice is a great example. And then, there are specters that are living in places that are too difficult to get to. The one I'm going to tell you about is part of that category. Nick became quite interested. Where is it? The inspector pointed at the floor, or more specifically, at the darkness beyond the metal grates everyone was walking on. The sewers, the inspector said. Nick also looked at the ground. Since the floor was essentially made of metallic grates, everyone could see and smell the sewers. In a way, the sewers didn't really look like sewers. In truth, just a couple of meters below the grates, there was just a sea of horrible and dirty water. If anyone broke a grate and fell through, they would fall for about 10 meters and then plummet into a deep pile of water filled with piss, shit, waste, garbage, and so on. There were cases where some of the victims were rescued, but most of them died quickly. In general, the people started to puke violently, which often made them accidentally swallow more of the water. This increased their panic, and they started to rapidly splash around. Oftentimes, they hit some kind of old and rusty nail, which then cut them open. Additionally, the parasite's minions, the rats, often piled onto the victim. Falling into the sewers was a terrifying death. Even more, not all of the floor was made of grates. There were also plenty of places with plates instead of grates. If one had exceptionally bad luck, one might fall into a dark part of the sewers. At that point, the nightmare's influence also attacked them. In the sewers? Nick asked. The inspector nodded. Nick's heart rate increased, and he had to take a deep breath. Where is it exactly? Nick asked. Are you really willing to jump into the sewers? The inspector asked with concern. Nick took another deep breath. Nick imagined himself standing in front of a hole, looking at the murky and dark liquid below. Just the stench would make a normal person retch. Jumping into that, the mental image was horrifying. To be honest, Nick hesitated a while. It wasn't easy to jump into something like that. The only good thing was that nobody would be seeing Nick down there, which would allow him to keep his unique ability active. This meant that drowning or getting pricked by a sharp piece of metal was no real concern. Nick's body became 5 times as powerful when no one was looking. That also meant that the durability of his skin and muscles increased. As long as he didn't ram into a metallic spike jutting out of a solid wall with all his force, Nick wouldn't get wounded. The rats also weren't that big of a problem. Yes, the parasite had a lot of rats, but every rat was valuable. The rats would be able to overwhelm Nick, but Nick would take many of them with him. Nick was quite sure that it wouldn't be worth the trade. So, While the sewers were incredibly disgusting and horrifying, they were not actually a danger to Nick. However, two other things would still prove to be very dangerous. One, the specter itself, whatever it was. No specter was weak, and Nick needed to overwhelm the specter, catch it, and bring it back to the surface. Two, the darkness. The sewers were dimly lit at best, and there were also many places that were completely dark. The darker the place, the greater the nightmare's influence. The nightmare's powers affected every single human in the world. It didn't matter how strong someone was, whether they were a normal person or one of the most powerful extractors in the world. All of them were affected by the nightmare equally. Power didn't matter, only mental fortitude mattered. Nick would need to resist the nightmare's influence for a prolonged period of time, while also actively searching for the specter. Nick only looked to the side. He said that the specter should be on my level, which means it's a level 1 specter. For a level 1 specter, someone has to jump into the sewers and resist the nightmare's influence. I can imagine that it wouldn't be worth the effort. Nick remained silent for several seconds. You know, the inspector said. Nick looked back. Maybe I misrepresented my reasons for helping you a bit, the inspector added. The reasons I mentioned earlier still hold true, but the order might not be the most accurate. The thing I'm actually most concerned about is the last reason. Nick only looked at the inspector. When we find such a specter, the inspector explained, my employer makes a risk assessment. Is it worth to go after it? What are the dangers? What is the potential profit? Since this is only a level 1 specter, it obviously isn't worth it. Because of that, we are just going to ignore the specter. That is until it becomes a level 3 specter. Nick narrowed his eyes. You're saying that they want the specter to feed on the population of the dregs until it becomes a level 3 specter? Nick asked. The inspector looked to the side. Well, my employer is a business, and all businesses are made for profit. When there is no profit to be gained, we don't get involved. My employer isn't letting the specter live just so that it can become more powerful. My employer just doesn't get involved since it's not worth it. My employer is not responsible for keeping the city safe. It's a business, not a charity. It's not my employer's job to protect the people. Nick's demeanor didn't improve. And if your employer told the city about the specter, the inspector didn't immediately answer. The city might do something about it, the inspector added, but they would need to pay quite a hefty sum in return. Also, maybe one day the specter might become profitable enough to catch. Nick didn't need to hear more. Naturally, the inspector wasn't allowed to speak ill of his employer, which was why he was wording it this vaguely. But Nick basically got the gist. The inspector's employer was willing to feed people to the specter until it grew more powerful, and the inspector didn't like that, which was why he was telling Nick about it. Earlier, Nick had still been on the fence, but now, not anymore. I'm doing it, Nick said. The inspector looked into Nick's eyes for a while. The inspector saw that they were filled with a bit of fear, but also a lot of conviction. The inspector took a deep breath. It's called The Dreamer. Chapter 15. Jumping In. Nick and Wintour stood in front of a destroyed street. The inspector had told Nick everything he knew about the Dreamer already, and Nick had also informed Wintour. As always, the sun was in the middle of the sky, and yet the sea of toxic waste still seemed dark. This part of the dregs was abandoned, and the road had broken into many pieces, creating a sort of ramp towards the sewers. Nick chose this spot since he also needed a place from where he could return. At this moment, Wintour was holding his nose with a white handkerchief, and he looked with disgust and concern at the dirty and grimy water. The two of them looked at the disgusting water washing across the broken and lowered metal plates and grates for several seconds. "And you're sure you want to accompany me?" Nick asked, as he looked at Wintour. Wintour didn't immediately answer. "You really don't have to," Nick added. "As the chief's ethics extractor, this is my job, not yours." Wintour just kept looking at the disgusting water. He took several deep breaths. Then he started to retch and cough. Yet, Wintour kept looking at the dirty water. A moment later, his legs shook a bit, and finally he sighed. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's fine," Nick said with a nod. "It's not your job." "Nick, I'm really genuinely sorry," Wintour added. I honestly want to go with you, but I just can't. I don't have the courage. Sorry. It's fine, dude, Nick said with a bit of annoyance. You can just stay here until I return. If I'm accompanied by something that's attacking me, you can help me with that. I will, Wintour answered with a nod. After Nick had signed the NDA, Wintour had also told Nick about his ability. As one of the heirs to the Melfion family, Wintour had received something to protect himself. Wintour's Zephix synchronizer was also already attuned to a specter. However, the ability the specter gave people was not something that was very useful for a Zephix extractor. It was basically only good for running away from someone. Nevertheless, it was still very good at what it did. While Wintour couldn't capture any specter on his own, he could still debilitate and weaken it. Naturally, Wintour had received that ability for two reasons. First, his parents wanted Wintour to have something that could protect him. Second, they didn't want Wintour to become a Zephix extractor, and the best way was for Wintour's synchronizer to already be occupied with a relatively useless ability for extractors. If I see anything attacking you, I will immediately support you, Wintour said with conviction. Nick just nodded. Also, since I'm not accompanying you, I might as well give you these, Wintour said as he took out 3 long tubes of glass. Nick looked at them with furrowed brows. What's that? Arclight, Wintour answered. And how will that help me? Nick asked. Everyone knows that artificial light sources don't help against the nightmare. This is different, Wintour said as he pointed at the 3 long tubes. Each one is harvested from a level 3 specter. They actually help against the nightmare. This surprised Nick quite a bit. Be careful with them, Wintour added. Each one costs around 10,000 credits, and they only work for a minute each. If you feel like you can't handle the nightmare's influence anymore, just break one of them. An area of light will appear around you, but it will dissipate after around a minute. The containment unit and building already consumed most of my budget, and I can't afford more of these arc lights without jeopardizing our daily operations. Use them when necessary. Nick looked at the 3 glass tubes with newfound appreciation and bound them to his thigh. Thanks, Nick said. Good, Wintour said with a nod. I hope everything turns out well for you. Thanks, Nick repeated. Then, Nick took a deep breath. At the same time, Wintour turned around. In order for Nick's powers to activate, Wintour also wasn't allowed to see him. For the next couple of seconds, Nick took several deep breaths. Finally, Nick put on some diving goggles that Wintour had bought him and jumped forward. Nick could have just walked into the murky pool of water, but he feared that he would turn around if he came into contact with a bit of the liquid. So he decided to directly jump in. Splash! The splash was noticeably more lethargic and subdued compared to the typical splash of water. It was just too viscous. Thanks to his ability, Nick easily jumped forward for over 5 meters without needing a running start. As soon as Nick touched the murky liquid, all his senses fired at the same time. Nick felt several small pieces of cloth touch his skin. He had also hit 2 small but solid objects, which were quickly pushed away by his body. The next moment, Nick felt how incredibly sticky the liquid was. In a way, it felt like the liquid was trying to trap him in place. Some of the liquid went into Nick's ears and nose, and he had to do his best to resist the urge to vomit. Disgusting. All of Nick's body shouted at him that this was disgusting. It was so bad. However, instead of immediately panicking, Nick remained motionless in the liquid first. He knew that he had to get acclimated. Nick had already pulled his knees to his chest to make the surface area of his body as small as possible, but his body was still violently shaking. He wanted to throw up so badly. He just wanted to push his head above the surface and scream. Yet, Nick just remained stationary. For several seconds, Nick didn't move. During these seconds, he felt several small pieces of cloth get caught by his body. Finally, Nick slowly extended his body. As he felt his chest and thighs come into contact with the liquid, his body shuddered again. And then, Nick slowly swam upwards. Splash. Nick's head broke the surface, but he didn't immediately open his eyes. He knew that he was wearing diving goggles, but he had still closed his eyes. Over the next seconds, Nick slowly opened his eyes as he looked upward. Brown and green liquid was sparkling as the light of the sun shone through them. Nick saw small pieces of bandages, and he even saw a couple of small pieces of bone on his diving goggles. Piss, shit, bandages, bones, teeth, blood, rotten meat, insects, poisons, splinters, rusty metal, puke. Together with water, all of that was creating the pool of liquid Nick was currently in. A moment later, Nick slowly wiped his goggles, mouth, and nose clean. Or at least as clean as he could. Finally, Nick took a deep breath. Surprisingly, the smell didn't feel as bad as before. But that was the only positive thing. "Nick, is everything all right?" Wintour shouted, still turned away from Nick. Nick took another deep breath. "I'm fine," he answered. "Good," Wintour shouted back. "I'm going to search now," Nick shouted. "Good luck," Wintour shouted back. The next moment, Nick took another deep breath, and then he swam forward, towards the endless depths of the sewers. Chapter 16, Ruins. Nick swam forward in silence. From time to time, he could hear the sound of someone walking on the road above him, but that was about it. All the other sounds were just the liquid sloshing around Nick's body and face. CRK. Nick's shin suddenly hit something solid, but thanks to his ability, his shin didn't receive any real damage. The next moment, Nick stopped and used his feet to see what was below him. After all, the liquid was so murky that he couldn't even see further than 10 centimeters. Nick's feet found something big and stable beneath him. In fact, Nick could even stand on it, allowing his torso to rise above the murky liquid. Wonder what that is, Nick thought as he continued wading across the stable foothold. Splash! But after some seconds, Nick lost his footing and fell forward. A moment later, Nick shot upward and scrambled back onto the stable foothold. "It's in my mouth." Nick immediately started retching uncontrollably, and it only stopped over 2 minutes later. Note to self, don't breathe in while walking forward, Nick thought. Anyway, seems like my foothold ended after about 10 meters. I guess that's the size of a house. A moment later, Nick decided to walk along the edge of the perceived building he was walking on, and within a minute, Nick had mapped out what he was standing on. Sure enough, it's a house, Nick thought. But then, Nick furrowed his brows. However, the form is unusual, and it's made of stone or brick instead of metal. Almost all houses have a slanted roof because of the rainwater, but the roof of this one is perfectly flat. Even more, all the houses above me are made of metal. A house made of something as luxurious as stone would be far too expensive for the people living in the dregs. Even the houses in the actual outer city are mostly made of metal, albeit rust-free. That was when Nick remembered what the parasite had said. The parasite had called the sewers ruins at some point. Ruins, Nick thought. I guess this stone house is part of the ruins then. But why are there buildings down here? Obviously, no one is living down here. Yet there are still valuable and functional houses. Even more, the sewers wouldn't have swallowed everything if we had just lived in the houses to begin with. Why did someone build a metallic city above this one? I don't know, Nick thought after some seconds. But one thing is clear. Humans have lived here before. Nick looked around a bit. I want to know how big the house is. The next moment, Nick went to the edge of the house, took a deep breath, and dove down. Nick's hands grabbed the rough stone of the house and pulled him downward. Since no one was watching him, Nick easily managed to pull himself downward. After descending for around 10 meters, Nick reached the bottom. But when he felt it, he furrowed his brows in surprise. Metal? The ground is made of metal here as well. The dregs were buildings made of rusty metal sitting on top of grates and plates of rusty metal. Below that, Nick imagined a stone house sitting on top of more metal. Then, is there even more? Nick pulled back and kicked the floor with all his power. Boom! The ground vibrated. But Nick suddenly felt pain in his leg. He knew all too well where that pain came from. He had hit something that was way too hard. This feels just as hard as the metal that Wintour's containment unit is made of. I think he called it steel, a house made of stone on top of a floor made of steel. This sounds way better than the rusty metal of the dregs. Nick thought about this for a while. There's not enough information. A moment later, Nick shot towards the surface to get a fresh breath of air before returning underground. Over the next few minutes, Nick mapped out the building. He even found the door and some windows. Sure enough, it's a residential house, Nick thought. By now, Nick had acclimated to the disgusting liquid, and as long as it didn't get into his mouth, he could keep his disgust in check. As Nick looked down at the house below him, he suddenly got the urge to investigate further. Maybe there is some treasure inside. Maybe there are some secrets to uncover. But then, Nick felt a bit of crackling from beneath his feet. The house wasn't breaking apart, but it definitely wasn't stable. That was when Nick realized something crucial. That's dumb. There's no way anything valuable would be left. After all, the people who moved here to build the city must have cleared everything out already. The next moment, Nick narrowed his eyes. Then, he remembered when this feeling had actually occurred. While Nick had been deep below the surface, he had already had the urge to investigate the house. In fact, the urge had been the strongest when Nick had found the door. It's already started. The liquid was so incredibly murky that no light reached a depth of even just 2 meters. This meant that Nick had been in pure darkness down there. The nightmare. The nightmare's influence could be subtle or noticeable, whichever was more useful. Naturally, the nightmare had influenced Nick in a very subtle manner down there, slowly planting ideas into his head of riches and secrets. If Nick had followed these urges, he would have been in quite a lot of danger. The house was not stable, and even more, the nightmare could also warp someone's perception and create illusions. It could have made Nick move in a different direction than he wanted, and without being able to see or hear down there, Nick wouldn't be able to find his way out. In the end, he might become panicked and break through the wall. But then, the house might collapse on top of him. The nightmare has already influenced me. Nick took a deep breath. I have to be careful. The next moment, Nick decided to stop investigating the ruins below him. Without a constant source of light, investigating the ruins was far too dangerous. I can look at them at some other time. For now, I should look for the dreamer. Chapter 17 Rules of the Sewer. Nick focused on searching for the dreamer. The investigator doesn't know what the dreamer looks like exactly, but he said that he knows it can fly. Physical and possession specters of the first level are not nearly powerful enough to fly without wings, which means that the specter is most likely a winged creature of some sort. As Nick swam forward, he kept looking upward. Naturally, the dreamer most likely didn't reside inside the actual murky liquid. It's probably living inside some of these structures. Naturally, there had to be some support for all the metallic plates and grates that made up the floor of the outer city. These supports came in the form of long and wide pillars of rusty metal, but they were not the only kinds of support. Nick had already found a couple of other ruins jutting out of the liquid. For example, there was a wide building made of stone that seemed to touch or fuse into the metallic plates above it. There were also several other sizable buildings made of metal and stone jutting out of the pool. While most of the normal pillars ended in a part of the street with a couple of plates, the sizable ruins that supported the city often ended in big areas of plates. There were no grates for over 10 meters around these big structures. Additionally, most floors below the actual buildings in the dregs were also made of plates instead of grates. In a way, since the sun was directly above Nick at all times, the map of the dregs was reflected on the murky liquid in the form of shadows and big areas of darkness. While Nick was swimming through the sewers, he was essentially following the roads of the dregs above him. It had a kind of bizarre sense of order. Sadly, this meant that Nick couldn't fully investigate every part of the sewers without having to enter the darkness. Many buildings were often clumped together, and since the people wanted to avoid the rising smell of the sewers as much as possible, they also replaced their floors with plates. This created areas of pure darkness over 100 meters wide. Naturally, there were also ruins and supports in these areas, and Nick couldn't see much from a distance. Nick was in the light, and if he wanted to look into the darkness, his eyes had to acclimate to darkness first. This meant that he had to enter the darkness if he wanted to see in the darkness. But for now, Nick avoided the darkness. He would only enter when it was necessary. Nick remained on the streets as he continued to search for any movement above him. The good thing about the sewers was that they were so incredibly toxic and disgusting that not even insects came here. The only movement Nick saw came from the rats scuttling across the ceiling of the sewers. Surprisingly, not even the rats were swimming in the liquid. Instead, they were scuttling across the metallic grates with their claws. In fact, there were quite a lot of them. In a certain way, these rats were the pedestrians of the sewers, since they also followed the roads. While specters were not being hunted by the nightmare, most of their minions were, so even the minions of a powerful specter, like the parasite, had to avoid the dark places. Luckily, none of the rats were looking at Nick, keeping his ability active. In the beginning, some of them had looked at him out of curiosity, but after Nick had thrown them a glare, they turned around. If the parasite annoyed Nick too much, Nick might decide to hunt its rats. So, out of politeness, the parasite tried to ignore Nick. As long as it didn't antagonize Nick, Nick wouldn't antagonize it. That was their unspoken agreement. For several hours, Nick continued searching for the dreamer. The sewers were kilometers upon kilometers long, but luckily, not all the flooring was made of grates. The dregs didn't surround the city. After all, no city would want every single visitor to travel through the absolute worst place they had. So, while the sewers covered most of the underground of the city, the dregs were only about 2 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers long. Nick was quite certain that the dreamer didn't go outside the sewers below the dregs. First of all, the other parts of the cities had far more Zephix extractors, and if any of them found a level 1 specter appearing near them, they would hunt it down. Every specter represented an incredible amount of wealth. Additionally, the nicer parts of the town had the sewers completely isolated, making it impossible for the dreamer to surface. This meant that the dreamer had to focus on the dregs. By now, it should be late evening, Nick thought. The sun didn't move, but Nick's inner clock was telling him that it was getting late. According to the inspector, the dreamer has received its name due to the method it uses to hunt and feed. Once a night, it leaves its nest and visits a sleeping person. While they are asleep, the dreamer creates terrifying nightmares for them, but doesn't allow them to wake up. For several hours, the person is stuck inside a terrifying nightmare. The next day, the person wakes up again, but they feel even more tired than before they went to bed. Naturally, they also need a long time to recover from the mental stress. Since it's already late in the evening, the first people should already be going to bed. In at most a couple of hours, the dreamer should leave its nest to feed. That's when I can find it. Sadly, I also need to reach it and sneak up on it. That won't be easy. But for now, I should wait. Nick went to one of the ruins that were below some grates and grabbed the edge. Then, Nick slightly pulled himself down so that only his nose and eyes poked out. He didn't want the dreamer to see him when it searched for its food. And like this, Nick waited. Chapter 18, Nightmare. Nick waited for several hours in the horrible liquid. During this time, he had a lot of time to think. For example, he had thought about how he had ended up in this place. Naturally, after being inside such a disgusting place for so long, Nick had questioned his life choices. But in the end, Nick thought that it actually wasn't so bad. After all, he was currently trying to turn his life for the better. The worse it was, the fewer regrets he would have in the future in case he decided to accept the investigator job. At least, he could say that he had even swam through a pool of piss and shit in an effort to become a Zephix extractor. By now, it was deep in the night, but the sun still shone brightly in the sky. Way fewer people were walking around above the grates, and Nick had also seen a drop in streams of piss and nuggets of shit coming down through the grates into the pool. Yet, Nick still hadn't seen the dreamer. He constantly kept a lookout for its whereabouts, but Nick just couldn't find it anywhere. It should be 12 a.m. already, Nick thought with furrowed brows. Most people should be asleep already, and there should be plenty of victims to choose from for the dreamer. Yet I haven't seen anything fly around. From this position, I can basically look at everything below the dregs, but I still can't see anything flying around. Naturally, Nick grew worried. Just to be safe, Nick waited for another 2 hours. But still, nothing. It should be 2 a.m. now, but I still don't see anything. By now, even Nick's powerful and strengthened skin started to get itchy all over. The liquid was a bit acidic, and Nick had been in it for over 8 hours by now. In the end, Nick surfaced with a helpless sigh. Since it's not flying around, this can basically mean only one thing. Its nest is directly below its victim's home. That means it doesn't need to fly around to feed. Nick looked around and focused on the several big and dark spots in his surroundings. The direct beams of light coming from above Nick created shadowy squares when blocked by the houses of the dregs. In a way, they created shadows of the houses themselves. But instead of being two-dimensional, it was like the shadows took up the entire space below the houses, creating a sort of black domain. However, there were also a few houses with a couple of small grates, representing small spots of light. These grates were mostly left in the houses as toilets. For now, I should focus on the houses with toilets. Nick created a map inside his head of the layout and started from the edge of the dregs. After swimming for a while, Nick stopped in front of the first dark place. In front of Nick was a shadowy area, around 20 meters wide and 50 meters long. There were 2 grates in that area of darkness. Naturally, houses in the dregs didn't get that big. This was simply a small block of houses with 2 toilets. Nick took a deep breath, and then he swam forward. Nick directly swam towards the beam of light in front of him, but he also kept looking around for the dreamer. He saw several pillars and even a ruin jutting out of the pool around him, and he looked at all of them. The dreamer probably wasn't very big, and it could probably even live on the sides of one of the rusty pillars. Nick inspected all the pillars. Suddenly, Nick's body shook, and he stopped moving forward. In front of him, the pillars seemed to distort and morph into each other. Just a couple of moments later, a terrifying grimace with teeth had been created, and it looked down at Nick with rage. Nick's heart rate rose. That's the nightmare. This is only an illusion. Yet, knowing that it was an illusion didn't help a lot. Nick's terror was still very present and visible. Someone with a phobia of spiders also knew that almost all the spiders weren't even dangerous. Yet, their fear was still overpowering. Nick was in a similar situation now. He knew that the huge grimace floating above him was not real, but he still genuinely felt like he was about to die. Nick's speed increased. It was almost like his disgust for the liquid had vanished as he desperately tried to get away as quickly as possible. "You're going to die." The darkest voice Nick had ever heard had just spoken that sentence, and Nick felt his mind shiver. Yet, Nick just looked forward at the safe beam of light that was the toilet of the house. "You're never going to reach it." The next moment, Nick saw the beam of light slowly going away from him. Nick's breathing quickened, and he didn't even care that some of the liquid entered his mouth at that moment. He needed light. Nick kept swimming, and swimming, and swimming. Why hadn't he reached it yet? From the start, the toilet was barely 10 meters away from him. That took some seconds, but that was it. Nick was quite sure that he had been swimming for over half a minute by now. Where was the light? Ha 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 ha. The dark voice laughed as the light traveled further and further away from Nick until eventually it was gone. There was no more light. There was only darkness. An endless forest of tall and rusty spires rose from the pool around Nick, but that was it. No matter in which direction Nick looked, he only saw an endless forest of rusty spires. There was no escape. The next moment, the grimace of spires slowly descended. Its expression morphed into a malicious smile. And then, it slowly moved towards Nick. Nick knew all of this wasn't real, but he also knew that he would die if he stayed in the darkness. The longer the nightmare influenced people, the worse it got. Nick turned around and swam away from the grimace. He had to flee. He was going to die. Ha 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 ha. The grimace laughed as it came closer. No matter what Nick did, it was coming closer. Nick closed his eyes in terror. He would die. "I'm sorry, Wintor, but I have to use it." Then, Nick grabbed one of the tubes of glass and broke it over his knee. Chapter 19, The Second Swim. The next moment, Nick was bathed in light. From black, everything transformed into white. Nick's eyes burned due to the sudden influx of light, but they quickly adapted. The next moment, the light became less bright, and Nick could finally look around. "How did I end up here?" Nick thought with surprise. Right now, Nick was between the 2 toilets when he had not even reached the first one. The nightmare must have created more illusions that made me change my trajectory. Nick took a deep breath. As long as I enter a sizable area of darkness, the nightmare can actually keep me perpetually trapped in it. No wonder no one wanted to search for the dreamer down here. The danger is not the dreamer. The danger is the nightmare. Nick noticed that the light was getting dimmer, and he was preparing to move forward again. I need to find a way to get to the toilet. A bit later, the light was nearly gone, and Nick shot forward again. The pillars were transforming into the forest of rusty spires again. However, Nick just kept swimming forward with all of his power. The next moment, Nick saw something dark slowly rise out of the pool in front of him. It was like a whale had just put its breathing hole a bit above the surface before submerging again. Something was in the water, and it was big. A second later, it rose again, but this time it was angled towards Nick. It was swimming towards him. Nick gritted his teeth, ignoring the liquid that poured through his lips, and then he tightly shut his eyes. But he continued swimming. Everything became silent. It was deathly silent. The only thing moving was Nick. He almost felt like he was in an endless void of nothingness. Ding! Nick's right knee hit something solid, but the object was pushed away. However, Nick knew exactly what he had just hit. It felt a bit soft, but with a hard core. It was a head. A human head. The next moment, Nick hit something again. This time, it was an arm. However, Nick just kept moving forward. More and more body parts appeared in Nick's way, but he just batted them to the side. "I'm sorry," the crying voice of a kid said quietly. The next moment, a small arm grabbed Nick's ankle. "I'm so sorry," the kid shouted. "Please forgive me." The next moment, several other arms grabbed Nick. They wanted to pull him into the depths. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." A chorus of different but desperate voices shouted from all around Nick as the grips of the arms tightened. Nick couldn't move anymore. He had been completely immobilized. Nick's terror reached new heights, but he only kept trying to swim forward. That was the only thing that could save him. Splash! Nick was suddenly pulled under. The arms tightened around him and continued pulling. And then, Nick suddenly felt it. Teeth. Huge teeth. Nick's legs hit a couple of teeth, and the teeth were almost a meter long. Even more, Nick's body wasn't nearly strong enough to resist these teeth, and his legs started to bleed. In his panic, Nick desperately tried to swim away, but the arms kept pulling him back. Even more, the arms seemed to come out of this thing's mouth. The arms were pulling him into the maw. Nick felt the maw advance. A deep shadow appeared around Nick as he was engulfed. There was another specter in here. And this was not a level 1 specter. He would die. He would die. Nick felt himself get pulled further and further down into the maw. And then, everything stopped. Nick didn't move for several seconds, but nothing happened. Slowly, Nick opened his eyes, and he saw light. He was below one of the toilets. "I did it," Nick thought in shock. "I actually did it." For several seconds, Nick just looked at the light above him. He was safe. There was no second specter. Splash. Suddenly, something splashed in the liquid in front of Nick, and all his anxiety returned. Nick looked down, and then he saw it. A floater. A turd. The person in the house above him had just taken a shit. Nick grimaced in disgust. Really, now? And with that, all of Nick's elation was gone and replaced by annoyance. Anyway, I can look for the dreamer now. Due to the extreme darkness, Nick couldn't see all parts of the ceiling from any one spot. Because of that, he went to the little safe spots to search the ceiling. The next moment, Nick poked his head into the darkness, but his body remained in the light. The nightmare's influence returned, but it was far weaker than before. By moving his head out of the light like this, Nick could look at the 100 square meters above him with quite a lot of confidence. However, since 100 square meters were only 10 by 10 meters, Nick needed to do this from several locations to check everything. After he looked at the ceiling above him, Nick readied himself to swim towards the next toilet. Obviously, the dreamer wasn't here. Nick took a deep breath and readied himself. "I've done this before. Now I just need to do it again." Then, Nick shot forward. The terrors returned. Nick closed his eyes. CRKSH. Nick stopped breathing as he felt some teeth tear a part out of his arm. The pain was brutal and sharp. Nick opened his eyes and looked at his right elbow. His flesh had been torn off. Only the bloody bone of his elbow was left. Is this real? Nick thought. I've never heard that the nightmare could do something like this before. Right? The teeth of the maw also tore my legs open, but when I reached the light, there was nothing. I have to keep swimming. Even though a huge part of Nick's arm had just vanished, he still continued swimming as he closed his eyes. He had to reach the toilet. The next moment, something tore Nick's leg off, and Nick was nearly pulled under by the force. Nick wanted to scream due to the pain, but he just kept swimming forward. He had to reach the light. He had to reach it. More and more of Nick's body was torn apart, and Nick wasn't even sure what he was anymore. His being was so overwhelmed with pain that his mind even blacked out for some seconds. He was dying. He wanted to die, but he wanted to live. It was so bad. It was so horrible. Just move forward. Just a bit. Please. Just a bit. And then, everything stopped again. Nick opened his eyes. He had reached the second toilet. Chapter 20, Too Much. Silence. Nick just looked at the ceiling in silence. He had expected that things wouldn't be as bad the second time. He had been wrong. Things had been even worse the second time. Back when Nick had been underwater, the nightmare had used subtle influences. The next time it had used horrors to stop Nick from moving to where he wanted. Then, it created illusions of Nick losing control and being swallowed. And now, it had just directly inflicted an unending amount of pain on him. The nightmare had lost all its subtlety. It had transformed from horror into terror. Nick just looked at the light at the ceiling. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. Fear, apprehension, relief, anxiety. This wasn't like the last time. The last time, Nick had been happy that he had managed to do it. But this time, Nick was not happy. The pain had been bad, real bad. For several minutes, Nick didn't do anything. He just looked at the ceiling with a worried expression. He didn't want to feel such pain again. He never wanted to feel something like that again. Just now, his body had been torn apart one piece at a time. This was a pain that should have killed someone. But he was still alive. Nick gulped in worry. I don't want to do this again. How many times do I have to do this? What will happen next? I can barely swim for a bit more than 10 meters in pure darkness, and it's already this bad. This is one of the smaller blocks of houses. There are blocks with no toilets, which means I have to look at the ceiling while under illusions. And then, I need to go back. Also, what about when I actually find the dreamer at the ceiling in one of those? At that point, I need to climb one of the pillars in pure darkness and catch it. The nightmare could easily show me illusions and make me move in the wrong direction. Nick just floated on the liquid as he looked up. Silence. I don't know. I have no idea how to find and catch the dreamer. For over 10 minutes, Nick didn't do anything. Naturally, Nick knew that he couldn't spend the rest of his life in the light of this little toilet. He had to leave at some point. Yet he just couldn't. The terror he had felt just now was too much. The pain was too much. He was only 16 years old. He had never undergone something this painful or terrifying. This was not the work of some random weak specter. No, this was the nightmare. One of the only 5 level 9 specters. Even the strongest Zephix extractors couldn't remain in the darkness for an extended period of time. The nightmare's power was absolute. It had killed tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of people just by mentally breaking them. It had killed people far more experienced and tenacious than Nick. I can't do it. Silence. I just can't do it. I have to do this one more time to get out, but I don't think I can enter another block of houses. Nick felt his chest shiver and hurt. Regret, frustration, self-loathing. I'm not strong enough to do this again. I want to turn my life around, not end it. If I go through something like this again, I don't know if I will ever recover. What then? I want to try my best. But if I fail, I fail. It's fine. I can become an inspector. It's not like I have some lofty and idealistic goal that requires me to become the strongest person in the world. No, I just want to live a good life. But what's the point of living a good life when I wake up in a cold sweat because I keep re-experiencing the things I have seen and felt here every night for the remainder of my life? Nick looked to the side at the block of darkness waiting for him, and then some tears appeared in Nick's eyes. I'm sorry. I just can't do it. I'm not strong enough. Silence. The only sounds down here came from the quiet scratching of the rat's claws and Nick's crying. It was just too much for him. Nick had just started his journey as a Zephix extractor, and he had already confronted one of the 5 strongest specters several times. This wasn't something that he could deal with. This was far beyond his current level. He gave up. For the next couple of minutes, Nick looked at the darkness around him. Then, he moved his head into the darkness and did a routine scan of the ceiling. Maybe he was lucky, and the dreamer was actually here. It wasn't. Nick took a deep breath. He only felt fear right now. He didn't want to enter the darkness again. But he had to. He couldn't remain here for the remainder of his life. Nick took another deep breath. It took a couple minutes for him to gather his courage. But eventually, he shot into the darkness again. As soon as Nick entered, nothing happened. However, Nick didn't let down his guard and just kept swimming forward. Silence. Nick just kept rapidly swimming forward in silence. After a bit, Nick opened his eyes. He saw the light of the street of the dregs in front of him. He was almost there. Nick continued swimming, and then he entered the street. Nick was now in the light of the streets of the dregs. Nothing had happened in the darkness. Nick turned around to look at the block of houses behind him with suspicion. Had the nightmare given up? He doubted it. Yet Nick was back in the light again. The nightmare had no influence over Nick here. Bang! Suddenly something hit Nick's head. Splash, 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 splash. Nick quickly shook his head and looked around him. Rats. Don't want to give me bodies, huh? One of the rats spoke. How about you give me your body then? And then, the rats all charged at Nick. Chapter 21, Target. As soon as the rats fell on him and attacked him, Nick gritted his teeth in fury. They had an unspoken agreement. You'll regret this, Nick shouted. This was different from the nightmare. The parasite only had a limited number of rats, and Nick could cause real damage to the parasite by killing them. However, the rats could also cause real damage to Nick. After all, they were real. 5 rats immediately jumped on Nick. Nick's right hand grabbed one of them and squeezed. CRKSH. The rat was squeezed into a thin sock of wet meat. At the same time, Nick's left hand turned into a fist and punched a second rat. Boom. The rat shot into the distance and hit the water over 50 meters away from Nick, skipping twice on the surface. However, the other 3 rats reached Nick and immediately bit into his body. One of them bit his right biceps, and the other 2 bit his chest. At the same time, Nick saw several more rats coming out from the water around him. Nick gritted his teeth in pain and hatred. Nick grabbed one of the rats and pulled. CRKSH. The rat's body was torn off, but the head remained stuck in Nick's biceps. Bang! Another rat was turned into paste by another one of Nick's punches. The last one let go and dove into the water while the other rats came closer. Just a second later, 3 more rats were jumping at Nick. Nick released several more attacks, but the rats just kept going after him without pause. Even more. The rats even started to attack him from below the surface. Nick's rage grew as he kept tearing the rats into pieces. It was never ending. Some seconds later, Nick had already killed over 15 rats. Yet they just kept on coming. The parasite really went all in. I would already be dead without my ability. And then, Nick's eyes widened. My ability? Nick stopped resisting the rats. My ability shouldn't be working right now. Yet, I am tearing these rats apart like they are paper. My ability is still active. This can only mean one thing. The realization had positive and negative aspects to it. On one hand, Nick wasn't being attacked by the real parasite, which meant that he had not actually been injured. But on the other hand, Nick had spun around so many times during the battle that he didn't even know which direction he was facing. In the end, Nick could only grit his teeth as he took one of the tubes from his thigh and broke it. CRKSH. All the rats vanished as Nick was swallowed by light. Just now, Nick had been in the street of the sewers, but as soon as the light appeared around him, Nick saw that he was still about 2 meters away from the real street. Nick had still been in the darkness. The nightmare had made it seem like I had already reached the end when I actually hadn't. Nick immediately swam over to the street, which wasn't difficult with only 2 meters between him and it. Now, Nick was actually back in the street of light. The nightmare can even create illusions of light, Nick thought with anxiety and fear. This is not something I can compete with. Nick looked back at the dark domain he had just left behind. At least I'm out now. The next moment, he looked around the sewers. There were over 100 similarly big domains. Nick had gone through hell and had used 2 arc lights after going just through one of them. This is beyond my level. Silence. Nick had been down here for several hours now, and he had become quite familiar with the sewers. But in the end, he had to leave without any gains. Even worse, Nick had even used 2 arc lights. Guess I'm going to become an inspector now. It's probably not a bad job. I get to leave the dregs, and I can probably also get a normal home. Maybe I can even build a family. Yet, no matter how enticing the position as an inspector seemed to Nick, he still felt regret. For a while, Nick just looked at the ceiling of the sewers. This would be his last excursion as a Zephix extractor. Wintour had already used up all the money he had access to. He had bet everything on Nick. Sadly, Nick would only disappoint him. Silence. Nick just watched the ceiling in silence. A bird flew past him. Suddenly, Nick's eyes widened. A bird? Nick's eyes immediately locked onto the bird as it entered a black domain representing a block of houses. Just now, Nick had been set on giving up. But now he was hesitating again. A bird, that must have been the dreamer. Nick's heart rate rose rapidly as adrenaline shot through his body. After hours, its old target must have woken up or died, and it had to go to a new one. Nick's eyes locked onto the black domain where the dreamer had to be in right now. There were no toilets in this block, and the block was about 50 by 50 meters. In the center of the block was the ruin of a stony tower, which supported the block of houses above it in the middle. As Nick looked at the domain, images of what had happened to him earlier reappeared in his mind. Pain, deceit, horror, death. Nick was finally free. He could finally leave the sewers. He no longer needed to go through the darkness again. But the dreamer was right there. Just once more, just one more time. But what if he didn't succeed? He might be risking his life for nothing. After all, the dreamer was obviously at the ceiling of the sewers. Nick would need to swim for about 20 meters in pure darkness, climb 10 meters of the structure, and then catch the dreamer. And he had to do that all in pure silence, so that the dreamer wouldn't notice him, and in the nightmare's illusionary hell. He couldn't even use the last arc light since that would immediately draw the dreamer's focus to Nick, which would deactivate his ability. At that point, Nick wouldn't be any stronger than a normal human. In such a state, the dreamer could probably just kill Nick without relying on the nightmare or the environment. If the dreamer noticed him, he would die. No matter how Nick thought about it, it was impossible. Chapter 22. The Climb. It was impossible. No matter how long he thought about it, it was just impossible. Yet Nick just couldn't stop getting excited. He wanted to do it. He wanted to try it. But he would likely die. Nick clenched his fists. I know it's a shit idea. I know I will most likely die. But I have to give it a go. I just have to give it a shot. Otherwise, I will never become happy. Nick took a deep breath. Then, Nick silently swam over to the black domain. Nick tried his best to move as silently as possible as he moved in a circle around the domain. He poked his head into the darkness and looked at the ceiling from different angles. Since Nick now knew what the dreamer looked like, he could search a larger area of the ceiling. However, even after searching for over 15 minutes near the edge, Nick still couldn't find the dreamer. This means it has to be at the center. It's probably even sitting on a part of the broken tower. The tower in the middle had several holes in it and a very uneven surface. Half of it had collapsed, while the other half supported the block of houses above it. The dreamer had to either be in one of the higher windows or on top of one of the two walls leading up to the ceiling. Nick took a deep breath and looked for a good way upward. I have to move silently. This means I can't just jump from wall to wall. I have to climb constantly and consistently. After a bit of looking around, Nick found a fitting spot. I can only climb the small windows at the tall front of the ruin. I think the tower is just one big spiral staircase in the middle, but I doubt that the spiral staircase is still intact. I could attempt to walk up the staircase, but the nightmare's illusions won't allow me to actually see where I'm going, and if I'm not careful, I might actually fall through a broken or missing step. That would alert the dreamer to my location. Nick just looked at the broken tower. It was so enticing. He could just use the stairs. Nick sighed. Nick couldn't trust his eyes in the darkness, and since he couldn't inspect the staircase from here, he couldn't risk climbing it. He had to navigate blindly, and he preferred taking the difficult route he could see instead of the potentially easy route that he couldn't see. Luckily, there are quite a lot of windows. Right to left for about 3 windows. Jump to the top right to grab the lowest one of the next floor of stairs and climb another 3. After that, 2 more windows will be above me and 1 more window above those. There is a small chance that the dreamer is in the 2 lower ones, but a relatively high one that it's in the highest one. Nick went over this plan a couple more times. And finally, he was done. The plan was set. Nick slowly swam to his starting position, which was facing the highest part of the ruined tower. Silence. Nick couldn't see the dreamer right now, but he knew that it was there. He knew that the likelihood of death was very high, but he had to do it. Nick took a deep breath as he closed his eyes. Silence. Seconds passed. Nick's eyes shot open, and he swam forward. As soon as Nick entered the darkness, he closed his eyes again. Then, he suddenly submerged. Swimming on the surface was way too loud, which was why Nick decided to move forward while being about a meter below the surface. Almost immediately, Nick felt several small fish glide across his body. It was like Nick had been submerged in a thick vat of small fish. The bodies of the fish disoriented Nick's senses, and he couldn't even feel the liquid around him anymore. Was he swimming forward or downward? He had already lost all sense of direction. The only thing I can rely on is my muscle memory. As long as I order my body to continue swimming forward, no matter what, I will reach the tower. However, just 2 seconds later, Nick felt things around him change. The mouths of the fish opened, and they started to tear into his body. Right now, Nick was surrounded by a pile of swimming maws with terrifying teeth. They were tearing at Nick's muscles, bones, and tendons. The pain was horrible. Nick's body kept shaking, but he just kept moving forward. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. The pain isn't real. It isn't real. Nevertheless, Nick felt like a dark void of hopelessness had opened in his chest. Just continue. Nick's flesh and blood were scattering across his surroundings. He was dying. But he continued. He had to continue. Bang! Suddenly, Nick hit something solid. Did I reach it? But then, Nick found an issue. Was this actually the end? Or was this another illusion by the nightmare? At this moment, Nick's emotions were going crazy. Was he? Wasn't he? In a state of panic, Nick did the first thing that came to his mind. Bang! Nick rammed his face against the wall. Nick immediately felt his eyes water as his nose broke in several places. Oh, this feels real. The nightmare's illusions were terrifyingly accurate. But when Nick compared the nightmare's sense of pain with actual pain, there was something different. Yes, the pain the nightmare created was real, but there were some accompanying sensations missing. For example, Nick had felt his entire head and mind vibrate when he had headbutted the wall. Additionally, Nick had felt like he was about to lose consciousness for just a moment. While the pain was the same, these sensations didn't exist when the nightmare created an illusion. Luckily, the ruin is massive. The dreamer shouldn't have felt that vibration. The next moment, Nick surfaced and grabbed the wall in front of him with his hands. I have to find the first window. In Nick's mind, he was rubbing against a huge wall as he desperately tried to find an invisible hole in it. Where is it? There. Nick felt something and pulled himself up with one arm. This proves that my ability is still active, which means the dreamer hasn't noticed me yet. CRKSH. The whole Nick had put his hand into suddenly sprouted teeth and was grinding it into a meaty paste. Nick's eyes became bloodshot beneath his eyelids as he tried to ignore the pain. After pulling himself up, Nick moved his hand to the left and jumped. He knew where the window should be, but he didn't know where it was exactly. CRK. Nick's hand entered a hole, but his fingers hit the other side of the window, splitting the nails of 2 of his fingers. Nick just gritted his teeth as he grabbed the window with his hand. The fact that he could stop his jump with one hand meant that the dreamer still hadn't noticed him. The next moment, the wall seemed to split open, and Nick felt like he was falling through it. It's not real. Nick moved his bleeding fingertips to the left side and felt the scratching feeling traveling over his body. He was still in the window. Even though Nick felt like he was falling into a never-ending abyss of pain, he jumped once more to the left. CRK. One of Nick's nails exploded off his body as it hit the wall of the window again. But when Nick felt that he could still pull himself upward with one arm, he became more excited. I'm doing it. Nick hadn't opened his eyes yet. He had done all of this blind. Now for the most difficult jump. After amending his plan a bit, Nick decided to jump to the second window in the second row. The jump was a bit higher vertically, but not as long horizontally. Nick's knees bent down, and he gathered all his power. The next moment, Nick jumped upward. In Nick's illusory reality, he felt like he was jumping upward hundreds of meters. It was impossible to tell how high he had actually jumped. Nick felt the wall in front of him rapidly move as he desperately tried to find the window. Fear and terror reached new heights. Crack! When Nick felt the tips of the fingers of his left arm getting crushed, he felt elated. The window. Nick fell a bit, but he managed to grab the bottom of the window with both of his hands. By now, Nick's left hand had become severely injured, with a couple of broken bones and destroyed nails. He pulled himself into the window easily, which meant the dreamer hadn't noticed him yet. He was so close. Nick quickly jumped to the left again as razors appeared on the wall in front of him, cutting his chest into pieces. Crack! Nick felt the impact of his broken bones rubbing against each other and grabbed the window. After pulling himself into the window, Nick's excitement reached new heights. He was so close. He could do it. Instead of jumping towards the next window, Nick grabbed the last tube of arc light. The next moment, Nick opened his eyes. A red hellscape of flesh and blades encompassed his reality. Everything was being consumed by the nightmare. However, Nick's eyes only looked forward with determination. Then, he threw the tube of arc light upwards with all of his power. Bang! The tube broke, and the arc light exploded at the ceiling of the dark domain. For an instant, all the darkness vanished as a shining star seemingly appeared in the dark sky. The hellscape vanished, and Nick found himself in the third window of the second row. However, Nick's eyes immediately moved across the ruins above him. There, in the highest window, Nick saw a black owl with black eyes. It was quite big, over 1/2 meter tall. At this moment, the owl was looking at the arc light shining on the ceiling. This was why Nick had thrown the arc light instead of breaking it directly. The dreamer's attention would remain fully on the arc light, and Nick would get a bit of time to reach the dreamer with his ability. As long as he managed to grab it without it noticing him, he could break several of its bones, turning it almost helpless. When Nick saw his target, his eyes narrowed, and he immediately jumped upward with all of his power. Nick easily and quickly grabbed the window directly above him, but instead of pulling himself into the window, Nick continued. The dreamer was now paying attention to its surroundings, and pulling into the window would take too long. Because of that, Nick immediately pulled himself upward and threw himself at the dreamer. The dreamer was still looking at the arc light. Nick was only a meter away from the dreamer. But then, he noticed that his jump hadn't been strong enough, and he found himself dropping. Nick gritted his teeth and rammed his feet into the broken stone of the tower. Some of his toes broke, but Nick managed to create a hole in the wall, making a foothold. Naturally, that was extremely loud, and the dreamer's head turned towards Nick. But Nick had already jumped again. Nick was flying at the dreamer. The dreamer was turning to Nick. Nick's hand came closer, and then their eyes met. Nick managed to grab the wing of the dreamer. He pulled with all of his strength. The dreamer pulled its wing upward. CRKSH. Nick tore out a couple of feathers. His ability no longer worked. He didn't have enough strength to break the wing. Nick's expression turned into shock and horror as he felt himself fall. The dreamer's black eyes looked into Nick's eyes. No. Chapter 23. Run. No. I was so close. Nick's ability no longer worked, which meant he was only a bit stronger than an average human right now. At this moment, Nick was falling from about 8 meters of height into a pool of toxic waste with several sharp pieces of metal. While Nick's ability was working, this wasn't an issue. But now, Nick's thoughts stopped. Time seemed to freeze. And then, time resumed as the dreamer got further and further away from Nick. Splash! Nick hit the liquid shoulder first. CRKSH. CRKSH. Several pieces of metal created cuts in Nick's skin, and he started to bleed. On top of that, Nick's destroyed fingers also came into contact with the toxic liquid. In an instant, Nick felt like his body was being drowned in acid. The force of the fall also made it difficult for Nick to move, but his adrenaline pushed him to immediately go to the surface. As soon as Nick broke the surface again, he took a deep breath, but then Nick saw the owl just a meter in front of him, its claws stretched towards Nick. The dreamer was attacking, and without his ability, Nick was helpless. Bang! Nick immediately pulled his head down into the water, and the next moment, 2 long claws tore through the water above him. The dreamer was not going to flee. No, it was going to kill Nick. Nick immediately dove further and further down, several pieces of metal scraping his skin. But then, Nick suddenly accelerated, and he stopped getting injured. Nick had reached a depth where the light couldn't reach him, which meant that the dreamer couldn't see him anymore. Nick's ability activated again. I have to flee, Nick thought. As long as it pays attention to me, I can't fight it. After coming to a decision, he immediately shot towards the direction of the sewer's exit. But then, a huge black eye opened in front of Nick, and he became paralyzed. Nick's thoughts stopped as he looked at the terrifying black eye. The next moment, a maw filled with teeth opened in front of him and swallowed him. Nick felt his body getting torn apart, but then he realized that this wasn't real. Since he was now in a place with no light, the nightmare's influence had returned. The dreamer above, the nightmare below. I can't move like this. The nightmare could lead me in any random direction. I have to surface to assess the direction I'm facing. Nick gnashed his teeth and shot upward. The eyes and maws around him slowly vanished. The arc light was still active, and it illuminated the surroundings. Shortly before Nick broke the surface, he suddenly felt the acid of the liquid become stronger. This meant the dreamer was seeing him. Nick broke past the surface and took a breath as he quickly looked around. There. Nick found the way he had to go towards and immediately dove into the water again. CRRSH. Nick clenched his teeth even more as he felt a big gash opening up on his back. Just now, the dreamer had created 3 huge gashes as it tore Nick's skin and a bit of muscle apart. This was a specter, not a random bird. If it got hold of Nick, it could probably stab one of its claws through his entire torso. A normal human couldn't possibly fight something like this. As Nick descended, the intensity of the acid subsided. He closed his eyes and immediately started to swim forward. A moment later, the heat of the water rose sharply, and it felt like Nick was swimming through a boiling pot of oil. Nick's entire body turned red, and he wanted to do nothing but scream in pain. He was burning. He was dying. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. Bang! Suddenly, Nick's right hand hit something solid, and Nick's head quickly followed. A house? Now, Nick had hit one of the ruins. He had to quickly make a decision. Immediately, he shot up. The house wasn't that tall, and there was still about a meter between its ceiling and the surface. At this moment, Nick felt a bit of light, but his ability hadn't deactivated yet. This meant that the dreamer hadn't seen him. Nick swam forward in silence, his chest almost sliding against the house's roof. Suddenly, the water started to severely burn him again, and Nick's body shook. His ability had deactivated. At that moment, a plan formed in Nick's mind, and he slowly spun onto his back. Nick was betting on the fact that the dreamer could see him, but not perfectly see him. Right now, since Nick was still about a meter below the surface, the dreamer could probably only see a vague silhouette or shadow. Meanwhile, the dreamer was illuminated by the light behind it, allowing Nick to perfectly see it. At this moment, the dreamer was diving towards him with its outstretched claws. Nick's anxiety reached new heights. The dreamer reached him. Bang! Nick shoved himself to the side as the dreamer's claws reached into the water. Due to Nick's depth, the dreamer also had to fully enter the liquid, slowing it down significantly. The dreamer's claws barely passed by Nick, and Nick immediately grabbed them with his two hands. The dreamer's wings flapped to get out of the liquid again, and Nick felt himself getting pulled up. Splash! The two of them left the liquid behind, the dreamer pulling Nick into the sky. Right now, the dreamer didn't have the luxury to look at Nick, but Nick's ability still didn't reactivate. Hearing and feeling someone also counted as perceiving someone. After gaining a couple of meters, the dreamer looked at Nick, and its beak opened. But by now, Nick had repositioned himself. He had pulled himself upward and had angled his body. And then, bang! Nick kicked the dreamer's head. While the dreamer was much more powerful than Nick without his ability, a kick to the head still hurt quite a lot. At the same time, Nick let go of the dreamer's claws and threw himself towards the exit of the sewers. His kick and the force of the jump completely disoriented the dreamer, and it fell into the water a couple of meters away. However, it wasn't significantly injured, and Nick was sure that it would return to flying above him in a matter of seconds. Only about 200 meters or so left to the exit. I refuse to believe that it will follow me to the surface. Nick immediately swam forward, and since the dreamer was still in the water, his ability had reactivated, and he swam with all of his power. Splash. Some seconds later, Nick heard the loud sound of something leaving the water about 30 meters behind him. 5 seconds after the sound, Nick's ability deactivated again. Nick gritted his teeth and dove into the water. More scratches appeared across his body. Bang! But the dreamer's attack missed, and Nick's ability reactivated. Sadly, just moments later, an army of maws tore at Nick's body again, and Nick felt like he was swimming downward instead of forward. Yet Nick just kept swimming. He ignored the pain. He ignored the horrors. Bang! Then, Nick hit something solid again. This is that one house I investigated. I'm just about 50 meters away from the exit. By now, Nick's lungs were screaming at him to surface. I have to run across it. Nick surfaced again. However, his ability deactivated before he even breached the surface. The dreamer wasn't stupid. It had seen where Nick had swam towards, and it was constantly looking in that direction. Nevertheless, Nick rapidly moved forward as he did his best to run in waist-high water. He turned back to look at where the dreamer was. The next moment, he saw the dreamer dive towards him. Nick couldn't evade. There were still several meters left. The dreamer would get him. Chapter 24. Struggle. Nick readied himself. He had to do something. At that moment, Nick's back began to burn, or at least, it felt like it. Light appeared around Nick, and then, something shocking happened. The dreamer's eyes burst into flames. Scree. The dreamer screeched, and it did its best to stop its dive. Nick had no idea what was happening. Nick, someone shouted between coughs. Nick looked back. Wintour. Wintour was standing just behind him, his expensive suit drenched in sewer water. At this moment, a bright fire was burning around Wintour, and his eyes had turned completely white. Get it, Wintour shouted before heaving and looking away from Nick. Immediately, Nick felt his ability become active again. When the dreamer's eyes had caught fire, its sight had been robbed from it, which meant that it couldn't perceive Nick anymore. Nick immediately turned towards the dreamer, which was about to pass about 2 meters above him. Rage appeared in Nick's eyes. Bang! Nick jumped with all of his power, the water around him exploding, and then he punched. Crack! Nick's fist hit the center of the dreamer's chest, and Nick swore he felt something break. And this time, it was not one of his bones. The dreamer's body spun in the air, and its flapping became very disorderly. Nick landed first, and he immediately rushed toward the place where the dreamer would land. Splash! The dreamer hit the water, and Nick jumped on it. Bang! Nick kicked one of the dreamer's wings, easily breaking it. The next moment, Nick grabbed the dreamer's thick neck with both of his arms and squeezed. Nick's ability deactivated again, but that didn't matter. Squeezing someone's neck didn't need a huge difference in power. Right now, Nick and the dreamer were tumbling in the horrible liquid of the sewers as he tried to strangle it. Yet, some seconds later, the dreamer's head spun by 180 degrees. Right, it's a fucking owl, Nick thought in horror. The dreamer's beak opened as it tried to tear Nick's neck apart. Nick quickly let go of the dreamer's neck. His left arm pushed the dreamer away from his neck, as his right arm shot towards its head. The next moment, the dreamer just saw two fingers become bigger and bigger in its vision. CRKSH. The dreamer screeched as Nick's fingers crushed its eyes. The dreamer's screech was cut off as the liquid from the sewers entered its throat. Nick gnashed his teeth in rage as his two fingers dug deep into the dreamer's eye sockets. Nick's thumb grabbed the bottom of the dreamer's beak, and he grabbed it with all of his power. The next moment, Nick wrestled with the dreamer awkwardly until he eventually managed to get behind its back, with his fingers still in its eye sockets. Splash. A splash appeared beside Nick, and Wintour appeared beside Nick. "Keep it like this," Wintour shouted. By now, Nick's legs had also grabbed the dreamer's body, and he was doing his best not to drown in the sewers. The dreamer was still flailing around in panic, and Nick had to do everything in his power to keep it suppressed. The next moment, Wintour took out some kind of flexible metallic cable and wrapped it around the dreamer's neck. The cable quickly started to shine red, and the dreamer's struggles intensified. However, Nick kept it stable. After around 10 seconds, the dreamer's struggles became weaker, and half a minute later, it completely stopped moving. "Can I let go?" Nick asked. "You, Hug, can," Wintour said with a heave. Nick slowly took his hand out of the dreamer's eye sockets, but still kept hold of the dreamer. "Put it in the sack on the shore," Wintour said quickly before he had to heave again. Nick nodded and pulled the dreamer towards the exit. About a minute later, Nick reached the exit of the sewers, and he pulled the dreamer onto the land. Now Nick could actually take a good look at the dreamer. Its chest was caved in. Both of its wings were broken, the second one having gotten broken in the scuffle. Black blood was flowing out of its empty eyes. One of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle. Many feathers were missing. Luckily, this was a specter. These wounds were not enough to kill a specter, and it would recover within a week at most. Nick took a deep breath, and then pain assaulted him. 2 of Nick's fingernails were missing on his left hand. 3 of Nick's fingers were broken. Nick had several cuts on his body. He had 3 huge gashes going across his back. Nick even felt some intense pain coming from his ribs. He guessed they had gotten bruised or broken during the scuffle in the water. And to top it all off, his nose was also broken. Nick was in a world of pain, and he also knew that the wounds were bound to get horribly infected, since they had all been washed quite thoroughly in the disgusting liquid of the sewers. He only hoped that Wintour had some way to help him recover. Nick knew if he had to rely on the medicine available in the dregs, he would die. His ability gave him some resistance to infections and poisons, but he wasn't sure if that was enough in this case. "Hurg." Nick heard Wintour heave as he came out of the sewers. Nick turned to Wintour and looked at him. Right now, Wintour was on his knees and hands as he coughed and heaved like he was about to die. "He wasn't able to follow me into the sewers earlier, but when he saw me in danger, he actually jumped in." Nick's trust in Wintour reached new heights. Wintour, the fancy heir of the Melfion family, a guy that constantly wiped his hands whenever he touched anything even slightly dirty, had jumped into the sewers to save him. Maybe he isn't as stuck up as I had initially thought. When it comes down to it, he is actually trustworthy. Nick took a deep breath. Right now, he felt elated. The risk had paid off. He had done it. "Wintour," Nick said. Nick only heard another heave. "We did it." Chapter 25, Walking Back. It took Wintour a while to recover, but eventually he managed to stop puking his heart out. While Wintour had been puking, Nick had shoved the dreamer into the sack they had brought with them. The sack was just a normal sack. When Wintour stood up and saw the sack, all his unhappiness and disgust seemed to vanish. A specter. They had a specter in their grasp. They actually had one. Then, Wintour saw Nick, and he had to take a deep breath. Nick looked really worn out. Blood was flowing from several parts of his body, and Wintour already knew that all these wounds would get infected very soon. "Are you okay?" Wintour asked. "Do I look like I'm okay?" Nick asked. Wintour winced, but Nick just laughed. "Relax, I'm okay. I'm just joking," Nick said. Wintour sighed. "You look really messed up, you know." "I know," Nick answered. "So, got anything that I can use to deal with these wounds? I kind of don't want to die, you know." Wintour just nodded. "We can visit a hospital in the outer city. Since we now have a specter, the money is going to flow in soon. Additionally, I need you to be at your best. After all, you are the chief extractor, which means that you not only have to work with the dreamer, but also find out how to work with it. Every specter is unique, and every specter needs to be treated differently to get the most Zephix out of them." Nick just nodded before he grabbed the sack with the dreamer. A moment later, Nick noticed how light the sack actually was with surprise. "Huh, that's lighter than expected," Nick said. "Specters have a lot of power, but they are using Zephix converted from prefix as their main source of power," Wintour explained. "Specters are actually pretty light. They are not made of a lot of Zephix, but the Zephix is so potent that they still manage to unleash incredible powers. That tall bird probably barely weighs 5 kilos. Nick nodded. The next moment, he slung the sack over his shoulders. The cable that Wintour had put around the dreamer was something that Nick had already heard about. It was a Zephix blocker, something that was used to stop the flow of Zephix. At this moment, the Zephix blocker was using up its stored energy to stop the dreamer's Zephix from flowing. Since this was the lowest grade, it would only work for about 5 hours when put on a level 1 specter. This meant that Wintour and Nick had to deliver the dreamer to their headquarters within the next 5 hours. But that was plenty of time. Wintour and Nick walked out of the entrance to the sewers and emerged in an abandoned part of the dregs. Wintour immediately took a deep breath of the dregs. He had never imagined that he would one day find the air in the dregs to be refreshing and enjoyable. As the two of them walked through the dregs, they saw all the people look at them with disgust while avoiding them. These two smelled absolutely abhorrent, even by the dregs' standards. However, the two of them didn't pay a lot of attention to the onlookers. They were far too excited about finally having caught their first specter. After about half an hour, they finally left the densest part of the dregs behind, and they entered the outskirts. The streets transitioned from being made of rusty metal into being made of polished metal, and the houses also started to become more uniform and orderly. Naturally, the people on the streets also seemed more well-dressed, and their reactions to the two of them were even more disgusted. "Stop." The two stopped as their brows furrowed. The next moment, two people wearing black combat uniforms walked up to them. The two men looked with disgust at them while they were holding their noses. "People like you are not welcome here. Leave the outer city, or we'll make you," one of them shouted. Naturally, the two of them were city guards, and it was part of their duty to keep the outer city clean from unsavory people. Two people stinking of piss and shit could be seen as unsavory. Wintour put his hand in this pocket. One of the two guards narrowed his eyes and shot forward, grabbing Wintour's arm before he could get it back out of his pocket. The guard thought that Wintour was about to pull a weapon on them. "Stop resisting," the guard shouted as he pulled Wintour's arm violently out of his pocket. CRK. The next moment, Wintour's wrist seemed to give, and it extended a bit further than it should. His wrist had been dislocated by the guard. While Wintour had an ability from a specter, he was not an athletic person, while the guards were very athletic and strong. Wintour gritted his teeth as the guard pulled his arm to the side to lock it behind his back. The next moment, the guard wrestled Wintour to the ground. While all of this was happening, Nick locked eyes with the other guard. Then, Nick looked down for a small moment before looking at the guard again. Naturally, the guard realized that Nick had essentially told him to look down. The guard glanced down and he saw a small card, which had just fallen out of Wintour's hand. The guard furrowed his brows as he looked at Nick, who only stared back without saying anything. In the end, the second guard kneeled down to retrieve the card. After looking at the card, the guard's face turned white in horror as he looked at Wintour, who was held on the ground by the other guard. The second guard immediately jumped over to the first guard and pulled him off. "James, stop." The first guard shoved the second guard away with annoyance. "What's your problem?" he shouted. The second guard shoved the card into the first guard's hands with urgency. The second guard looked at the card with annoyance, but then his eyes widened, and he turned to look at the person below him with terror. At this moment, Wintour glared at the guard with venom. The guard froze. In his hand, the guard currently held a residency card for the highest floor of the inner city, and the name on the card was Wintour Melfian. Naturally, the guards knew exactly who they were currently looking at.